Hello, YouTube, and welcome to today's stream where we've got Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and James Fodor of James Fodor, the YouTube channel. And today we're going to be discussing the digital physics argument for God's existence, which I think is this unique to you, Michael, as well, this argument. Obviously, you've got some other influences and things, but it's your conception, right?
Well, I mean, I worked with it. I got a lot of ideas from Johann Rotz and some other idealists, but the formulation is something I've been working on.
And so Michael is going to be taking the proposition that the digital physics argument works, that it basically leads to the conclusion that a God exists. And James is going to be taking the opposite position in this debate. Michael is a Christian, so that's the position that he's coming from. And James is an atheist and a naturalist. So to give you a little bit of a background of the two different worldviews that are on offer here. So we're going to start with opening statements from each. So there's a 15-minute time limit. Michael's going to go first, then James will do his opening statement, and then we'll have an open discussion for around about an hour with some time for Q&A at the end. So if you've got those questions, if you get them in throughout, I'll be taking notes, and then as much time as we've got at the end, we'll put those over to the guys and see what they've got to say. So if we're all happy then, I'll put me and James backstage, and Michael can go with the first 15 minutes. I'll only start the timer when you start with your presentation, though. So there's the thingy, and we'll hop backstage.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to set my own timer here just so I keep track.
No problem.
Can everybody see that? All right. Cool. I think I'm ready to go. All right. Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I appreciate the dialogue, and I appreciate James for agreeing to have the conversation. Let's just jump right in. So we're talking about one argument I use for God's existence, the digital physics argument. Since that is the case, what is nice is I can use my opening time to talk more about the argument than I usually do in debates. James is aware of a lot of the data I use, and so I've got a lot of questions about objections he's presented in Hangouts, but hopefully we'll get to that later. I'll start by noting I'm a classical apologist, so I'll be arguing a theistic or deistic worldview is more probable than a non-theistic worldview. And I don't claim I can prove God exists. Essentially, my goal is, as William Lane Craig says, to show how high the intellectual price tag of atheism is, and that a theistic worldview can better account for the data. On the outset, I fully acknowledge and expect that James will offer alternative possibilities to the data I will present. That would be missing my overall point, because no one denies there's other ways to explain the data. The point the theist is making is that God is the most plausible and parsimonious explanation. So first, by God, I mean a necessary and immaterial mind whose nature would be ideal or absolute perfection. And I'll explain more what I mean by absolute perfection later on. So here's the argument. If the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. The universe is emergent, therefore the universe is emergent from a mind. And by universe, I'm simply referring to the macro world we inhabit, or space-time. So I'll start by defending the second premise and then move to the first. But let's start with the basics. So the common belief among many laymen today is the universe is composed of particles. But as both Nathan and James are aware of, quantum field theory really doesn't show that. As physicist Walter Schmidt says, particles are actually waves in different types of fields. This goes for all the particles that we are made of. We are all just made of waves in a field. What looks to us as a billiard ball on the billiard table is actually a bunch of waves moving from the cue to the pocket. Now, having gone through several of James's videos, he's obviously aware of this. In some of his responses, he advocates for the view that everything is reducible to quantum fields. In this video around 2730, he says, why don't we just put God aside and say it's just quantum fields themselves that are real as physical things? I feel like my worldview is just simpler because I don't need to posit God. Now, I'll get to the first premise of my argument later, but when I heard this, my immediate response was to realize how problematic this can be. This is because, as philosopher of physics David John Baker notes, many of the problems particle interpretations have also apply to field interpretations. Wave functional space is equivalent in a mathematically rigorous sense to the Fock space. That means just local algebraic constructions that are used in quantum field theory. That represents states as particle configurations. This has the consequence that two of the most powerful arguments used against particles are also arguments against such a field interpretation. And this in turn indicates that field interpretations are not, as many have assumed, a readily available alternative to particle interpretations. If the particle concept cannot be applied to quantum field theory, it seems that the field concept must break down as well. Now, this can get really complicated, but in a nutshell, there are many mathematical problems with saying quantum fields are underlying objects, like the inability to assign Fock space, and other issues like spontaneous symmetry breaking. I don't have a lot of time to go over this, but if you want more, a physicist I've been talking with just brought this to my attention. Two philosophers gave a talk going over some of Baker's work, although their conclusions might have been a little harder to decipher. So, as Baker concludes, it seems that in many ways, field and particle interpretations must stand or fall together. They essentially both just seem to be mathematical representations. So just appealing to fields to escape the problems that show particles cannot be underlying objects really doesn't work, because a lot of the same mathematical issues come up. Philosopher of science Meinrad Kuhlmann notes physics lacks a coherent account of fundamental issues, such as the definition of objects, and that it's not at all clear what a particle or field even is. He says quantum field theory really doesn't tell us what substances that quantum fields would be. Instead, we only get an understanding of things like structures, their activities, and properties. He says it kind of sounds like having a marriage without spouses there, because what we have in quantum field theory is nothing concrete or a reference to objects or a substance. And he also says quantum field theory works without any relation to a fundamental substance that gives rise to fields and particles. So this can be a problem for saying that everything just reduces to quantum fields, because quantum fields do not appear to be anything concrete or a type of substance to support materialism. Physicist James Glatfelter says the very notion of materialism now appears misguided, and philosopher Jan Westerhoff agrees. The more we'll draw from the reductionist scenario seems to be that what either is fundamental is not material, or that nothing at all is fundamental. Now, to be clear, the reason why I'm quoting so many experts is so people are aware this is not just coming from me, but from the experts who work in the philosophy of quantum mechanics. Essentially, what they're arguing is that our macro reality appears to be emergent from underlying information, not fundamental objects we would call fields or something else. This would support my second premise of my argument. Also supporting this is the holographic principle. Now, I want to talk with James more about this because I'm confused by some of the objections he's brought up before. But essentially, Leonard Susskind says this is not a fringe theory. It is mainstream physics. I was given permission to use this quote. Naish Afshordi says, after talking with him privately, saying the holographic principle is a fringe theory is factually incorrect. The vast majority of researchers in quantum gravity believe in the holographic principle. Now, basically, it came about from studying the physics of black holes. I can talk more about it later if we need to, but Susskind notes the implication is the three-dimensional world of ordinary experience, the universe filled with galaxies, stars, planets, etc., is a hologram, an image of reality sighted on a distant two-dimensional surface. Now, I agree, and he's right, this is an analogy, but he also says it's an approximation of what our reality is like. Also, I've talked about this past a 2017 paper that showed that this holographic model is compatible with the data found in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Quick note, I never said in my video this proves the holographic principle. I said it was compatible with cosmological observations, and I never argued for emergent spacetime from this one alone, so I just want to point that out. Now, there are other ways I can argue for emergent spacetime, but I don't want to dwell on this premise too much because I want to get to James's argument where he suggests it's simpler to say everything is just quantum fields, and he has suggested this is simpler than including God. In other words, why not just stop with quantum fields? Well, so far I've argued this is untenable because quantum fields do not appear to be a substance or built from localized objects, as physicists and philosophers of physics point out. So we need something concrete like a fundamental substance from which all other things would be dependent on or emerge from. Quantum field theory really doesn't necessarily include any reference to these types of things. It can work just fine without them. So this is where I talk about my first premise, and I'll argue it's the most likely explanation would be a necessary mind, and this is probably where most of the disagreement will happen. And I'll present 4 supporting arguments. Again, I agree that James can offer alternative possibilities, but again, it's about what is the most plausible and parsimonious explanation. So the first one is to look at the nature of reality and draw an inference to the most probable explanation. So if all of material reality can reduce to mathematics, properties, and abstractions without any reference to a material substance, then it can better fit with an idealist worldview. Whereas material reality is merely information contingent on mind. Instead of, as on materialism, positing an undetectable material substance that gives rise to quantum fields and then particles and then somehow builds conscious agents, we should merely stick with what we know exists. Consciousness and a material reality that reduces to information. In other words, let's shave off all mind-independent objects and stick with what we know exists. So no need to posit an additional substance beyond that. Stick with an idealist ontology. Whereas the materialist has to include mind-independent objects beyond our immediate experience. James has argued in numerous hangouts when he's criticizing substance dualism that positing a wholly new type of substance is unnecessary to account for the data. I agree, but if reality is purely mental, as the data would suggest, then this would also imply that there's a necessary mind at the basis of all. And supporting this is idealist ontologies are far simpler than dualist or materialist ontologies. Next, we can return to our definition of God and reason abductively as to why a theistic worldview is simpler and posits a less complex foundation than a non-theistic worldview. So materialists often posit a non-conscious entity at the foundation of reality, something like a singularity, or James said last week, a metastable quantum state. Graham Oppie has used terminology to describe like a naturalistic, necessary initial physical state. But I will argue a theistic foundation is more parsimonious and posits a less complicated foundation. So by absolute perfection, I'm referring to perfect being theism, which only posits one fundamental property, absolute perfection. And by absolute perfection, I mean the core properties of perfection entail all great-making properties, such as omnipotence, omniscience, necessity, and omnibenevolence. God's attributes are derived from an absolute perfection that is simple at its foundational core. Now, naturalism lacks this foundation and entails an imperfect foundation to account for reality. And this would mean one has to entail physical reality or some aspect of it with the complexity associated with, as a brute fact or necessary as is. And this is far more complex than a conscious being with a simpler ontology. Philosopher Ryan Byerly notes there is nothing in proposed non-theistic foundational entities that would explain why they would be necessary. One is just supposed to accept it as a brute fact. However, theism eliminates this and reduces the number of brute facts we posit because the definition of God entails necessary existence. A theistic foundation has an internal nature that has sufficient resources to explain its properties and ontology. Essentially, ideal perfection has an internal nature that can explain its own necessity. But there's nothing about the internal nature of some imperfect foundation that would explain its own necessary existence. On naturalism, it's just a brute fact that certain things exist, or naturalism is left with unexplained necessities. So theism has a foundational explanation that reduces fundamental bruteness and provides more explanatory depth beyond what a naturalistic account could ever offer. As Brian Leftow says, so far then it seems that perfect being theism can explain more of the natural than naturalism can, with equal explanatory power as Graham Oppie concedes, and leaves less brute at the fundamental level in doing so. Theism's extra ontology buys a lot. Now, there's obviously more I could say about this, but for the sake of time, I need to move on. Also supporting this, we can point to another correlation using quantum cognition. James has said on his channel he thinks this is a coincidence, and I want to discuss this more with him, especially because the disagreement might result from an underlying disagreement on philosophy of mathematics. But ultimately, theism can explain far more like this correlation, whereas a materialistic account lacks an understanding of this. What the argument is that in 2009, physicist Diedrich Ertz published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. Also, this is not just hypothetical, because psychologists have already been applying quantum cognition to their field and finding out that it is more successful than traditional cognitive models and has provided principal answers to many puzzles and challenges. But what this means is that in our inner mental world of thoughts, qualia, dreams, and emotions can be modeled in terms of quantum processes. And these are the same processes we discussed that would give rise to space-time and matter. So space-time and matter are emergent from the underlying quantum world, and our inner world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes through the study of quantum cognition. And so my argument is that what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from the same properties of a mind. A simpler explanation is the universe is just emergent from a mind, especially if we combine the three arguments I've used thus far. So I reached out to Ertz and his team to discuss this more. One of his research partners got back to me and said, yeah, this could just be an odd coincidence. But he's argued that the correlations, i.e. the similarity in behavior between human concepts interacting with human minds and quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter, could be caused by the fact that both entities share the conceptual nature. Finally, I need to move on as well, but a fourth argument is to look at the recent work of Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Felitti, who wrote a paper on the similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web of galaxies. There they show the properties of neural networks within the human cortex are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies. Now, this is something we would expect if the universe is emergent from a mind and an idealistic worldview is true. This doesn't really make sense from a materialistic perspective, though, because, as philosopher Bernardo Kastrup notes after drawing on their work and discussing it, he notes that on idealism, brains are the images or representations of conscious minds. Elsewhere, he says that on idealism, the brain is the external appearance of what a first-person conscious agent looks like. So no one here is positing dualism. If the universe is emergent from a mind, it would be expected the universe would in some way be the external appearance of that conscious agent as well. So I would argue we have good reasons to support the first premise of my argument. We have 4 different arguments that point to a mind as the foundation of reality, and they can work together like chainmail, building on each other. Now, a materialist can always offer other possibilities to explain this data. James does that a lot in his book, Responding to the Kalam, when he talks about the personal explanation behind the universe. In regards to my argument, James has said that he believes everything is reducible to quantum fields, and that a simpler explanation would be saying that everything reduces to quantum fields without including God. However, parsimony is not just about offering a simple explanation. It's about offering a simpler explanation that can adequately account for all the data. Throwing out alternative possibilities doesn't mean you've offered a more probable explanation that has explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, and parsimony. The problem for the materialists is they leave a lot as unexplained coincidences or brute facts, or they posit multiple foundational entities. Theism offers a better account of the data by appealing to one explanation and also leaves less explained, or less unexplained, I mean. So with that, I'll yield the rest of my time, and I will take notes while James presents his.
Awesome. Let's bring James back in and take that off screen. Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. That was really interesting. And just from my point of view, it's really cool to see how your presentation's like changed over time, and you've brought more stuff in, and like that's a very different argument to say like 2 years ago. So you've clearly been working on this a lot. So it's really good to see. So James is now going to give his presentation then. So I'm just going to reset the timer on my end. I'll put us backstage, James, and then you're on mute right now, just so you know, and remember to take yourself off. And then whenever you're good to go, I'll start the timer. Oh, I think your share just dropped off a second. Yeah.
Back? Yep, there we go.
Yeah, I got it.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nathan. So before starting, I just want to thank Michael for coming along here and agreeing to chat with me about this. I think it's he raises a lot of very interesting issues and has clearly caught people's attention with this. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. And he's the first one of the various people Nathan and I have critiqued over the past few months that has been willing to come on and chat with us. So I'm also really grateful for that. So that being said, let's get into what I have to say. So I don't know how long my initial remarks will go for, because I think I've got a lot of sort of specific things to say about some of the studies that Michael quotes, which may be best left for sort of discussion time, but we'll see how we go. So a bit on where I'm coming from, as I think Michael and Nathan both said, I'm an atheist, but I'm also a materialist, reductive naturalist. So yeah, I believe that everything that exists in reality is in some sense reducible to the ultimate physical constituents of reality, whether those are quantum fields or something else. Maybe we don't know exactly yet. That's an open question. But regarding the digital physics argument, so I have a number of concerns about the digital physics argument, which I'll sort of indicate in these first few minutes. So here is the digital physics argument as Michael has presented it. If the universe is emergent from a mind, the universe is emergent, therefore the universe is emergent from a mind. So I want to say a few things about each of these premises, although I'm going to sort of flip the order around because I feel like it makes a little bit more sense to start with the second premise. So again, at the outset here, I'm just going to be presenting some general reflections, and hopefully we can get into the details of this a bit more in the discussion time. So the first thing I want to say about this premise here, that the universe is emergent, is that I just don't think it's true to say that we know that the universe is emergent. There's many different things that one can mean by this, including whether we're talking about gravity being emergent or space or time being emergent. There's different theories that would apply to different conceptualizations of this, although various theories in quantum gravity might say that all three of them are emergent. But we don't have a quantum theory of gravity yet, and so it's really premature to say whether we know that this is the case. Indeed, it's difficult to read ontology, that is fundamental existence, off of scientific theories at the best of times, as Michael indicated actually just before with his the paper that he referenced about interpreting quantum field theory. But that quantum field theory is a very well developed and very well evidenced theory, whereas quantum gravity is not. And there are literally dozens of different models of quantum gravity. And so I'm just not convinced that we can really say at this point whether we know with any degree of confidence really that quantum gravity would result in emergent space-time / gravity or any of those points that Michael is advocating for. So hopefully we'll get to talk more about that in the discussion time, but I'm not convinced of this. Now, the second point is that even if we did know that gravity, space-time, or some combination of those were emergent from something fundamental, something more fundamental, that doesn't mean that they're unreal or an illusion. So I don't know if Michael used that language in his opening presentation. I don't think he did very much, but he certainly has in his previous videos. And I think some further clarification of that would be good to make in the discussion time. But I just want to say something about this here, because it's extremely important to understand that just because gravity or space and or time is not fundamental, that doesn't mean that it is unreal or an illusion or something else. It just means that it's not fundamental. There's different models that have different things to say about this, but the basic idea is usually something like there's something that exists at the base of reality, some sort of, let's say, quantum structure, for want of a better term at this point. And under certain conditions, often it would be development in low energy conditions or some sort of spontaneous symmetry breaking or something along those lines, gravity / space / time would come about as a result of the interactions or behavior of that underlying quantum structure. That's just like how the phenomena of temperature is an emergent property of the kinetic energy of the particles in the air, or the weather is an emergent phenomena of the atmosphere, and so forth. That's very common in physics and indeed in science as a whole. And there's really nothing sort of mysterious about that or that points to something beyond it. So I think that really any arguments from quantum gravity about the emergence from quantum gravity theories about the emergence of space and time, it just don't really point to the fact that there's anything beyond the material reality that the sort of space, time, or gravity needs to be emerging from. So I have a very different interpretation of what these theories are saying than Michael does. So those are my main objections to this premise here. I don't think we know that space, time, gravity are emergent, and even if they were, it doesn't mean that they're emerging from something non-material or that they're unreal in any way. It just means that they're not at the fundamental base of reality like we might have thought. All right, now let me turn back to the first premise, that if the universe is emergent, then it's emergent from a mind. Unsurprisingly, I also even more strongly disagree with this premise as an atheist, not surprisingly. So Michael mentioned quantum cognition models, and again, it would be good to talk more about these in the discussion period. I do not believe they support cosmological emergence from a mind or really anything of that sort, as Michael indicated. I think that these models are best viewed as a relatively recent attempt to model certain aspects of cognition, particularly like categorization and decision-making in certain contexts, to account for certain phenomena, such as ordering effects of questions or context-specific biases or other factors that humans make. And they're relatively successful in certain applications, but just because a mathematical modeling technique is successful in making certain predictions or in explaining certain phenomena, it doesn't mean that all of the mathematical apparatus that's used for that theory should be interpreted like literally. And even there, I think that these theories don't really even need all of the mathematical apparatus that they're borrowing from quantum mechanics. So there's further details of that I'd like to discuss later, which are probably best left for the discussion period. But basically, I think it would be a gross overstep to say that because certain aspects of quantum mathematics have been adopted to explain certain psychological phenomena, that therefore there's some connection between quantum mechanics and cognition. I think that that's a gross overinterpretation there. We just don't have any reason to think that. The second point that I'd like to make about the emergence of, the basis of the emergence of the universe in a mind, is that quantum mechanical theorems and experiments do not support the role of minds in quantum mechanics. So I don't think Michael mentioned these very much in his opening remarks today, although he has in many of his videos in the past. So I thought it would be relevant to mention these. In particular, he's mentioned the Bell inequalities, quantum eraser experiments, Leggett inequalities, Koch-Specker theorem in various of his videos in the past. Now, if Michael doesn't feel that these are particularly relevant or important in the argument that he's defending today, we don't have to go into them. But because he's defended them in quite a lot of detail in the past, I thought it would be important to comment on them here. And I think that in all cases, these either theoretical or empirical results are really just constraints on a viable quantum theory. And again, there's obviously a lot of details there. I'm not explaining what these are, so we'd have to go into that. But I don't see any basis for the support that these provide any support for the role of minds in quantum mechanics. I think that's a misinterpretation of what they're saying. All right, so those are my two sort of key objections to the premises. Now, there are, I think, some further problems with the argument, which maybe could be phrased as objections to either premise or reductios of the argument or something like that. But basically, the entire theory is very complicated and, in my opinion, ad hoc. So obviously, Mark's not going to agree with this, but hopefully we can discuss this more. So I've taken this diagram here. Again, I don't remember if he showed this in his presentation today. I think he didn't, but he showed this in a video previously, and I thought it was perhaps useful to illustrate this point here, that there's, in the theory that Michael's outlining here, there's physical reality, or at least the appearance of physical reality. But then in that appearance of physical reality, there's sort of the appearance of physical reality and then also the appearance of mental reality. But then underpinning all of that is this mathematical Hilbert space structure, which is then used to describe both the mental phenomena and the physical phenomena, and that's the base of the quantum mind theory that we talked about before. But then underpinning all of that is God, right? Who is immaterial mind and perfect and necessarily existent and all that sort of stuff. This just strikes me as very ad hoc and complex as an ontology, with all of these things fitting in with each other. And well, as Michael actually himself indicated, I just think it's much simpler to say that the fundamental nature of reality is quantum fields or something like that. Michael was correct to note that there is difficulty in interpreting quantum field theory, just like many physical theories, in terms of exactly which part of it's to regard as like real, or which parts are mathematical formalisms. We can talk more about that, but I still think that's a far more eloquent and parsimonious ontology or explanation of what exists. There's another concern I have. It's unclear for me how to reconcile the ontology or the metaphysics that Michael's outlining here with certain aspects of Christian theology. And I don't doubt that Michael has some explanations here that I'm not aware of, but I think it would be good to discuss that more in the discussion time. So let me just outline a couple of points with respect to that before finishing up. So here's a little sort of toy argument here that I came up with. So I'd be interested to hear what Michael thinks about this. This argument is really just supposed to make a point. I don't want to get too caught up on the precise formulation of it, but hopefully this would be helpful. So this is one aspect of, this is just drawing out an aspect of how I find it difficult to reconcile what Michael is defending with Christian theology. So we'll see how this goes. So here's the first premise. If we are simulations in the mind of God, then we are part of God. I've bolded that premise because I think it's going to be the most controversial one here. Now, from the digital physics argument, it seems that we are simulations in the mind of God, because I believe that is what Michael believes. Or if you prefer not to use the word simulation, then perhaps there's a different word that one could use, but we are derivative from the mind of God. So that's what I mean by saying simulation there, and he has used that word in the past. So if we are simulation in the mind of God, and if premise one is true, then it follows that we are part of God, at least in some sense, right? But we are sinful, which is undoubtable in Christian theology. So then the fourth premise here, if we are sinful and we are part of God, then a part of God is sinful. Now, I take that to be a fairly straightforward premise. It's just saying that if we're part of God and we have this other property, then a part of God also has that property, because we are a part of God. So it follows from these premises here, 2, 3, and 4, that a part of God is sinful. But according to premise 6, if a part of God is sinful, then God is simple simpliciter. That just means that God is sinful, like period. And that seems to be fairly straightforward. That's just saying that, God can't abide sin and this sort of thing. And you can't have like a sinful bit of God, but God be sinless overall. That doesn't really seem to make sense. So it would follow that God is sinful simpliciter. Now, that's obviously an untenable conclusion there, which is sort of the point of the argument, that it seems that something's gone wrong here. My guess would be that Michael's going to reject possibly this premise, which I think is the most controversial here. Maybe there's others that he would want to object to. But my point there is that there seems to really be a tension here that identifies us as a part of God, or like a simulation of God's mind or something like that, whilst wanting to make certain claims about the distinction of fundamental distinction between like sinful, fallen humanity and perfect and necessary God. So it'd be good to discuss some of those aspects a bit more in the discussion. Now, another issue here that I wanted to raise, which is that it seems to me that the idea of space-time being emergent actually undercuts cosmological arguments in favor of God's existence. Now, I don't know, maybe Michael would actually be all right with this because he thinks the digital physics argument is better than cosmological arguments, but I think that this is an interesting aspect to draw out. So here's a way to illustrate this point. So classical space-time emerged from something more fundamental, information, micromatter, quantum fields, or something along those lines. That's basically just what Michael's been arguing. So then premise 2, if classical space-time emerged from something more fundamental, a cosmic beginning does not imply an immaterial personal cause of the universe, because the cosmic beginning can be explained in terms of the emergence of space and time from this more fundamental quantum-like state. Therefore, a cosmic beginning does not imply an immaterial personal cause of the universe. So this would be an undercutter to a Kalam or other type of first cause cosmological argument. Now, again, that doesn't prove that theism is false, but I think it's an interesting implication of the type of sort of emergent cosmology, emergent physics that Michael's advocating for. And I'd be interested to hear whether he thinks that would follow, or that you can still run a cosmological argument, or how that would fit together. Okay, that's just a little spruik from my book and podcast, which I threw in there. So I think we can put that to the side. So yeah, I think that's about all of my time. So let me just conclude by saying that I'm interested in discussing this argument more. And obviously there's a lot more specifics that I'd like to get into with respect to some of the studies that Michael has quoted. But as I said, I think that's best left for the discussion time. So I'll stop here and look forward to chatting about this further.
Awesome. Thanks for that, James. And I think that made your position really clear, and both of those presentations kind of set us up for a good discussion going forward. Just before we get into that, I just want to say thank you for those people who have been giving super chats during that time. I wasn't putting them on screen because I didn't want to interrupt the flow of people presenting and stuff. But if you do send in super chats with questions, then I will be keeping those and putting them up the priority for the Q&A at the end. So thank you for saying this is better than Eurovision. And thank you, Shannon, as well, for your super chat further down. Yeah. So basically, guys, it's up to you now for the next hour or so. It's going to be like an open conversation format, unless it gets like too one way. That's the only circumstance I'll kind of intervene. So who wants to kind of go first with a question, really, to get us started?
I mean, if you want, I can address those Christian issues if you want, or we can talk more about the direct argument.
No, I prefer to start more by talking about the argument, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So yeah, those were just drawing out some implications of the potential theological tension there. But I think it'd be interesting to start by looking at the argument itself. So if I may, then perhaps we could turn to the premise that, or whichever premise it was, I think it was the second one, that the universe is emergent. So so as to you presented a lot of different avenues of evidence for this, both today and in other videos. So I think it might help if I ask you what you think the best couple of lines of evidence or papers or whatever it is that you think are most persuasive, and then we can talk about that rather than focusing on things that might not be as important.
Well, given that I had limited time today, I went with the two best that I use.
Okay, sure. Which would be?
So the idea that quantum field theory. So let me clarify really quickly. When I'm talking, sure. I'm a scientific realist like you are, but I would be something called an ontic structural realist. So what we mean by that, it's a growing coming out of ontic structural realism. It basically is the idea that science refers to the structure of physical reality and its relations, its activities, without any reference to some sort of fundamental substance. Science is only sort of like a about sort of structures and whatnot. So I would be an ontic structural realist when it comes to quantum field theory, because I would follow someone like Meiner Kuhlmann, Susan Schneider, even Trent Doherty, that when we talk about science, it doesn't really talk about any sort of reference to material substance in that sort of regard. And so like Kuhlmann, for example, notes that this is sort of evidence that there's, if you can do science without any reference to an actual like substance, like individual localized particles or objects or whatnot, it really has no need for it. So that would be one argument I use to argue that the universe is sort of like, as you bring up in your book, John Wheeler's idea of it from bit. You mentioned that as an alternative to Craig's personal source behind the universe. And I would say that's very much in line with what I'm at, but I don't think that would contradict the personal source behind the universe.
Okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit. So you're saying that because scientific theories, or at least like fundamental physical theories, don't need to postulate sort of fundamental substances, that they talk about the structural relations between, structural relations, let's say, then what follows from that?
Well, Kuhlmann's basic argument is that there's no need to posit any sort of like classical understanding of like individual particles or like some sort of substance in that sort of sense. And ontic structural realism has been criticized by critics because they argue, one actually argues it leads to idealism. If you're going to posit that science, it was a funny thing when I came across that in the paper. But yeah, it's the idea that if all of science just sort of reduces to mathematics and abstractions, well, I mean, that sort of implies an idealistic ontology. The actual physical world, the world of our particles and whatnot, is emerged from underlying information, which is exactly what the idealists have been saying for centuries.
Okay, so I'm a bit concerned with this language of emergent from underlying information, because I feel that's a little bit vague. So let me just make a couple of comments then. So I don't have a firm view about the precise nature of the reduction or of an interpretation of scientific theory. So you've been advocating structural realism. I think that's interesting. I know that that's increasingly prominent, but I'm still working out my ideas here. So I don't want to advocate for any specific view here. However, I will say that from what I've read, I have concerns about some of the structural realist approaches, because they appear to be saying that it's the structural relations of theories that should be interpreted realistically, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think from one reason is that, just that you indicated there, to say that the mathematical structure of a theory is what is real doesn't seem quite right to me, because mathematical structure, I think, is abstract and doesn't exist in itself. It describes something that exists. So that seems to me using the wrong language there. But the other concern would be that if you're to say that what is real is some sort of relation, like structural relations between phenomena that can be described with equations or whatever, then it seems to me that a relation implies relata. That is, there needs to be two things that you relate to each other. And I don't know how you can, I believe this criticism has been levied in the literature, that it's unclear how you can have relationships without things that are being related, that are themselves real. So I would say that I think there probably does need to be something underlying, some underlying physical thing, whatever it is exactly, that exists and that behaves according to, in accordance with the equations of quantum field theory and so forth. And I think in the literature this has sometimes been described as local beables or something along those lines, the thing that exists that the equations describe. And so, I mean, that's how I would avoid going down an idealist route, because I just think that there is a something. I've called it quantum fields before, but I mean, if we don't want to use that term, we could call it something else. And it's the behavior of this stuff or this thing that is described by the theories. So
three things I would say on that. I mean, so I remember last week in that hangout, you mentioned you were a deflationary nominalist. So hopefully we can talk more about that in regards to the mathematics, because there's a couple issues I have with that, relying on philosophers like Hilary Putnam or Quine, for example, and the problems with nominalism in describing mathematical entities. With regards to this underlying ontology that you speak of, that there has to be sort of objects that are describing the relations, that's not necessarily the case. I can use an analogy, for example. I use this analogy a lot, but in a video game, we don't need actual particles within the video games. It just sort of emerges from code. And of course, the code is contingent on a substance, of course, which would be the computer. But it doesn't need to be these individual bits of matter or whatever. I forget the term you exactly used, that are actually inside the computer bouncing around to describe the relations. It can all be explained through sort of code. So, for example, Minor Kuhlman notes this, but he says, like, for example, to quote, what we call an electron is in fact a bundle of various properties. 3 fixed essential properties, mass, charge, and spin, as well as numerous changing non-essential properties. You can build all of these kind of things out of just the properties using idealist ontology. We just simply describe it as you would describe how a simulated world emerges from a video game, even though there's no actual little bits bouncing around in there. It's emergent from the code, and that's analogous, or that's emergent from the computer, which is, of course, would be analogous to it emerging from the substance we would call God. Now, the other issue I have is that, I mean, you're a strong critic of substance dualism. Talked about it a lot. I agree with a lot of your criticism of substance dualism. We don't need to posit an additional substance to explain something in terms of that. I agree. So why do we need to posit an additional substance here when the science doesn't really suggest it? It can work fine with just out it. We can explain everything without it. Why would we need to posit an additional substance?
Well, let me consider your second question. Why do we need to posit an additional substance? So I don't regard it as an additional substance. I think it's, well, okay, I'm somewhat uncomfortable even using the word substance, but let's just go with that for the moment because it's just a bit metaphysical and I prefer to stick more with what the science says directly. But sure, we do need to interpret the science and what does it actually say about reality? And as a realist, a scientific realist, I do think that the scientific theories, at least confirmed theories, do say something about the real world, at least approximately. And so therefore, I'm happy to say, yeah, that there's some substance, if we want to use that term, that the theories describe, or substances. So I don't think that's an additional substance. I think that is just the ontological content of the theories, if you want to say it that way. It's just what the theories talk about. And so the idea here is that as a materialist, you'd say, look, most people believe that the material world exists. Now, I'm not actually sure if you would agree with that, or as an idealist. But
yeah, I agree it exists, but idealists, we love to use David Hume's bundle theory. If you read like Susan Schneider, Helen Yoder Chappell, even Trent Doherty or Todd Burris, it's the material world. It's there. It's real. I'm an objective idealist, but it's like a bundle of properties.
Yeah. Okay. So let's. So that's fine then. But the point is that most people believe that the material world exists. Well, simpliciter, I guess, or without that qualification. But even you think that it exists in some form. So then the question is, do we need to posit anything beyond that? And that seems to me would be the additional substance that's postulated by a substance dualist theory. So to say that, if we're not going to say that material reality exists as sort of a fundamental substrate of reality, then what are we left with? Well, I think what you would say is we're left with idealism, right? But there needs to be something in our reality, unless we're going to be just instrumentalists. That is to say, we're just going to say, look, the scientific theories that we have are just useful for predicting observations and for technological applications or whatever. But they don't really say anything about the way the world really is. That's one route to go down, right? But if we want to be realists and say that the theories describes the real world in some way, then there has to be something that exists beyond just the theories. And what I would say is that stuff is just the material world. It's just material reality. And it seems like that although you say that you don't believe in dualism or multiple different things, you do have sort of levels to reality, that there's the appearance of material reality, or the bundle theory of it, or how you describe it. And then there's the underlying the fact that there's a simulation or an emergent something in God's mind. I don't know the exact words you want to use for that. So that just seems to be more complicated than we need. Why not just stick with the material reality and not have to say there's something underlying that?
So let me first start by explaining the idealist ontology and then answer the question as to why the idealist ontology is simpler than the materialist one. So for one, you said we need to posit sort of something with regards to the material reality. Well, to posit something requires there is someone there to posit something. And this is the idealist point, is that there is a conscious agent already there. So we have to posit conscious agents already. The idealist just says, let's start with what we know it exists. Like I said in my opening presentation, conscious agents, and then the material reality as science describes it in terms of just reducing the properties and whatnot, mathematical abstractions. That's the idealist ontology, is we're starting with conscious agents. So, you say in your book on page 340, when you're responding to the Leibnizian cosmological argument, you talk about how whatever the fundamental substance was, it is. That's what it was beforehand. Well, that's what we would argue is consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental. And then the material reality is just simply there. So there's not much to posit beyond what we intuitively understand with regards to reality. We don't have to posit two substances. We posit one, namely a conscious, or all is mind. And then there's information that's contingent upon mind. So you have two layers there. Okay, and then the materialist, on the other hand, is why I would say this is more complicated. You got to posit an undetectable substance beyond what science can currently detect, and then somehow from that it builds quantum fields, particles, and then somehow the hard problem is somehow solved. And you also mentioned last week you're reductive natural moral realist, so then it also has to explain the emergence of moral values and duties. So we have all these layers of positing on top of positing on top of positing. And as I went over in my section of perfect being theism, we could just posit one foundational entity, a conscious mind, that explains why there are conscious minds, and it explains the information of reality. So there's far less being posited here, far less brute facts being posited.
Well, needless to say, I don't agree with that. But so the thing is, we need to stay focused, because I can't possibly defend a theory of morality and a theory of mathematical objects, is something you mentioned before, and all of these other things in one discussion. Also, we're supposed to be discussing the digital physics argument, not does reductive naturalism hold. Although I do come from that point of view, but like reductive naturalism could be nonsense, but the digital physics argument could be fallacious, right? So I do want to focus a bit more on that. But so just maybe to cap that off a bit, I will say that well, because this is relevant as well to assessing the merits of the competing theories. I think one of the fundamental problems with idealism is that it does reduce a lot of our experiences to brute facts. Now, your particular version of idealism is a bit different there, because it's objective idealism. So there's further issues there. But so, for example, if you want to say that material reality as we know it is a bundle of properties or an emergent phenomena or something in God's mind, you still have to have all of the regularities and posits that the physicalist would have to. You have to say, look, there's some sort of fundamental quantum substrate, or at least the appearance of that exists in God's mind, and it behaves particular regularities. Space-time emerges from that. In God's mind, it behaves regularities as well. Like, all of the regularities of physics have to hold. But the question is, why do they hold? It seems that they just hold because God wants them to hold, and he could just as easily want them to not hold, or to hold sometimes. It seems to me that it's just a postulate that at any given time God wants these regularities to hold. Whereas the physicalist has an explanation for this, in that these are direct descriptions, or at least approximate descriptions, of the way reality just is. And so they couldn't just change at some time, whereas they could if they were in God's mind, right? Because he could just want something to be different at any time, or imagine it being different. So I think that's a lot simpler, because you don't have all these brute facts that just says, well, God wants the appearance to stay that way at all of these different points in times.
So are you a necessitarianism? Would you say that everything is like necessary as is and there's no mere possibility?
No, I don't have very strong views about modality, but I wouldn't say that, no.
Okay, yeah, I mean, Oppie, for example, talks about that as being an issue. But I mean, like, even so, if you're not, then even on a materialistic understanding, you still have to posit the idea that there is this probability out there. So, for example, classical physics is, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's classical physics is not the way it necessarily has to be. Because it's necessary. It's contingent. There's a probability field regarding the certain number of universes out there. So, I mean, if you're not in necessitarianism and you don't have a perfect foundation, the universe selection pressures would just remain unexplained on naturalism. It's just not the way it is. Why did it have to be a certain way? My basic point is the laws of nature are just the way they are in your view because of a brute fact. So I don't see how that's not somehow different from me, because you still have a probability need to calculate into the naturalistic worldview and to terms of what God's actions would be, like, similar.
Well, the difference I see it is that, yes, I have to either give an explanation or just say that there is no explanation for, why, say, material reality is the way it is, why quantum structure this way, not the other way. But the theistic idealist has to do that as well. But they also have to say why it's consistent. So once you have an ontology, you say, look, we've got a bunch of quantum fields or something like that behave this way. That's part of their essence, right? That's just what they do. They're not just going to suddenly do something different. So you don't have to explain the consistency of that. You've got initial postulates or initial contingencies or whatever it is, and then that's all there is to it. But under theistic idealism, you've got, well, why does all of that behave that way? But at the next instant in time, or I don't know, different part of the universe or whatever, it could just be completely different, because in God's mind, it can be whatever. Like, there's no one substance or set of substances that are fundamental that give rise to all of the other aspects of reality. It could be like that if God wanted to, but he could decide that he doesn't want it like that anymore, or it's like that in one part of space but not the other, or one part of time but not the other. It seems to me that it's all contingency after contingency, because God could imagine or emerge it up or think up whatever he wants. The materialist doesn't have that problem, because all of reality is given by the underlying ontological substances that exist, and that they just have the properties that they have, and they're not just going to spontaneously do something different. But that could happen in God's simulation of reality, it seems to me.
Well, hold on. Why couldn't you? I mean, you admit you're not necessitarian. Maybe there's like the initial quantum state could just, or maybe the laws could just sort of change. I mean, Leonard Susskind posits that maybe the laws of nature are different, or the observable universe is much bigger, or the actual universe is what he says is bigger than the observable universe, and the laws of nature he posits could be different in other places and whatnot. It sounds exactly the same to me. But the difference is you're positing multiple brute facts. I'm saying all of this reduces to God's actual foundation. No.
It's clearly not. It's clearly not reducible to God's. So does God, under your view, does God have a choice about the constants of nature, or the laws by which the simulated universe operates? Or is that all necessarily following from his nature?
No, the laws of nature don't have to be the way they have to be.
Yeah, right. So that's all the same level of brute fact that I'm describing. But I think the difference is okay, so let's suppose there's a multiverse, right? And that there's different laws of physics, or different constants, at least, in different like parts or branches of the universe. Sure, that could happen. But that is still, or at least the postulate, what I'm saying is, we don't know, right? But it's the postulate that would be ultimately describable in terms of, let's say, the properties of underlying, let's say, quantum substrate. Again, we don't know the exact words to use there, but like there's some underlying set of properties that reality has on the basis of just what it is. And maybe that can give rise to different, branches of the universe with different constants or whatever. But it can't just do anything, right? It's restricted by what properties it has. Whereas God's simulation can literally do anything logically possible, because it's just a simulation in God's mind. So I think that you have a lot more explaining to do as to why we see what we do see, and more brute facts to postulate that God wants it this way or that way or the other way.
Well, just because a mind can have a complicated thought, that doesn't mean it entails a complicated ontology. What you're positing is a very complicated ontology, this underlying substance that somehow is a certain way it is. It has no internal nature to explain why it is that certain way, just sort of accepted on a brute fact. And this is why I quoted like people like Eric, or like Lefto and Byerly, who point out that the internal nature on a theistic foundation can explain its own necessity. Whereas on the other view, we have to accept all these various brute facts, that certain things are the way they are, that certain laws of nature just are the way they certain are. Now, I agree that the laws of nature are a contingency, but I'm not positing that that's just the way it has to be because it is. I'm saying the foundation would be a perfect being. And he can, of course, explain. Now, what I'm getting at is that the internal nature of the agency can explain that specific foundation. It's a lot less complicated of an ontology versus just positing some sort of undetectable material substance that just is a certain way that a certain is, brings about electron null a certain way it is. There's just multiple brute facts being posited here.
Again, I think there's a I think maybe we should move on soon, but maybe just go for a little bit longer.
Yeah, because I got a question regarding that anyway, so.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about some of the evidence you give in favor of emergentism, which I think is important. But let's just maybe finish this off for a few minutes. So first of all, I don't think I'm postulating undetectable substances. I mean, it depends what you mean by undetectable, but we're both scientific realists, so we're both happy to read off, to some extent, in some sense, an ontology or a reality underpinning the scientific equation. So we're both doing that. So I don't think that there's a difference there. The question is the plausibility or the simplicity and so forth of what we're postulating. So now there's a question about the contingency of what happens in reality. Now, I'm happy to say that maybe there's brute facts, maybe there's brute contingencies, maybe necessariatism is necessary. It's a hard word. Necessariatism is true. I'm not sure about that, right? But my point is that I think there's a symmetry there, because whatever I say about the underlying basis of why the material world is the way it is, the theist has to have a similar story. You can't derive all of that from God's nature, and you've just agreed with that, because none of that follows from God's necessary nature. So sure, God may exist necessarily. Of course, I could just postulate something that exists necessarily as well to get around that. But I'm just going to put that to the side and just say, okay, God might exist necessarily, but all of the aspects of the material world or the emergent universe that exists in God's mind, none of those follow necessarily. They all have to be postulated. But I think that there's an additional issue here, because you need to also postulate as to why it doesn't change arbitrarily, or why miracles don't occur more often. Basically everything that occurs in God's mind is, I think, a contingent fact, or possibly a brute fact, about what God wants there to be in his simulation, because it could be different, right? And that's the key point. Anything that happens in God's mind could be different, as long as it's, logically possible, because God could imagine it up whatever way he wants. That just isn't true in the reductive materialist worldview, because once you've got the initial substrate, what follows is required by the properties or the nature of that substrate. That just isn't true in God's simulation.
Well, I don't think that every thought sort of has to be a brute fact. I don't think that follows at all, and that's what left toe example was talking about.
But of course it could, because it could be different. At least contingent. I'm not necessarily say brute fact
things, but by that logic, then every single action that has ever existed in a naturalistic worldview would also just have to be a brute fact.
No, because they follow necessarily. It depends if you think that there's quantum indeterminacy, right? So we have to. But that again, that applies in the theist case as well. But the point I'm making is there's a lot more extra. That sounds like, but there's extra contingency in the theistic idealist worldview, because many more things are possible, right? So contingency is about one thing happens, but other things could have happened. So why did that thing happen? But many, many more things are possible in the theistic idealist world, because it's all in God's mind. He can think whatever he wants. That's just not true in the materialist worldview.
But extra contingency is not an issue. Graham Oppy...
It absolutely is an issue, because you need to explain why this and not that. That's the whole point of a theory, to provide explanatory power. And the theistic idealism doesn't, because it doesn't say why there's really any regularity at all. God could just imagine up whatever he likes. That needs to be explained why we see what we do.
Once again, this goes back to the idea of an agent as the basis of the universe. It's not the only brute fact we're positing is namely God, and that, of course, he can, create any sort of universe that he would want on that setting. But we don't have to just say that, the way he chose it did because of a brute fact. That's just a contingent outcome from an agent choosing certain things. So I don't understand where you're
but that needs to be explained as well. You can't just get around this by saying that, God could choose whatever he wants. That's precisely the problem of the theory, that it doesn't account for why we see what we do see. And there's a much wider range of things that we could have seen, because God can do anything.
So, for you to posit a Zodiac killer killed a bunch of people, do you need to know all his thoughts or intentions? Or can you still say there was a killer regardless?
I'm just trying to see the connection there. So if I'm to postulate that someone did something, I need to appeal to their motivations or reasons for doing something.
But there was a Zodiac killer, even though we don't know his motivations.
Well, I don't really know anything about the Zodiac killer, but we maybe could know that. But that's not true. We always know things about people's motivations. We don't know anything about God's motivations.
Well, no, not necessarily. We have for example, so the Zodiac killer was a guy in the 60s and 70s, never caught, killed a bunch of people. He left notes and whatnot that people have deciphered over the years. Okay, but we don't know why he did it necessarily, but we do know that there was one. So even Peter Lipton, for example, who's an atheist, says explanations do not themselves need to be understood. A drought may explain a poor crop, even if we don't understand why there was a drought. So positing a mind at the foundation does not mean I have to know all of the thoughts regarding that. That's appealing to contingencies that aren't necessarily important when we're going to the necessary foundation.
Okay, so let me say this one more time, because I feel like we're talking in circles here. So what is a good theory supposed to do? A good theory should tell us why certain contingencies pertain and not others. That is, of the set of possibilities that could have happened, why this one? That's what we try to do in science. We say, look, I could have observed a whole bunch of different experimental results, but I saw this one, or maybe there's a couple that you saw, right? Why those? And we construct a theory that says that. It's similar, I think, in a philosophical theory. It says, why do we observe things, very broadly understood as observations? Why things appear to be the way they are, or are the way they are, right? And we construct a theory that says that. So that means that to be a good theory, we need to say, why this and not something else? My contention is that there are some things that are unexplained under the sort of materialist theory that I'm advocating for, but they are much less than the things that are left unexplained under under theistic idealism, because everything could be different at any point in time and any point in space if God wanted his simulation to be that way. I'm not saying that an explanation needs to explain everything behind it. I'm saying that it's extremely implausible because it just doesn't explain anything. It just says they are the way they are because that's God's simulation. That's not a good explanation because it could just equally be anything else. And the theory can't predict why this and not that. It's equally consistent with any possible outcome. That's my concern.
Well, first of all, we're talking about metaphysical theories. We're not talking about necessarily scientific theories.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the same in terms of how we. I don't think anything I've said is non-standard. That's how we evaluate the success of a theory, to be able to explain why certain things pertain and not others.
But you also said that on the materialist worldview, the laws of nature are the way just because they are. And then you also said the problem with theistic idealism is that the laws of the nature are the way they are because God willed it to be. I mean, you're just appealing to sort of
but
like
they
the
don't
same
have to
kind
be.
of underlying issue.
I feel like I've made my point. So I'll if you want to have the last word there, I'll let you. But I don't know that we're making any progress here.
I want to bring up
so I'd like to move
something
on to something else. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to ask you about something you said last week.
Sure.
In your hangout, around like 2 hours and three. You said something to the effect that you just don't see the value of cosmological arguments because whatever you want God to do, the atheist can just posit something else to do that, and at best you're at a standstill. So with regards to that, if you're positing something, I mean, when I heard that, I was kind of like, yeah, but that kind of gives the theist what he wants. Because if you're positing something that's sort of uncaused, that somehow is able to change from one state to another, like you also talked about in that hangout, and it also gives rise to conscious agents in the universe, you're basically just positing God and just not titling it God. I don't see how that's going to get around the issue.
So God is you define God as a perfect. So, God is typically defined as an immaterial mind. I think. Are you okay with saying that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just checking because the idealist point is a bit different. So I just want to make sure the language is consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So God is an immaterial mind who has all of the perfect making attributes, or good making attributes. And this includes omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, among others. Now, if the materialist, or if anyone really, is going to postulate a being that has those properties, then they're postulating God by a different name. As long as whatever they postulate doesn't have those properties, then they're not postulating God.
Well, not necessarily. You could posit, like, as you've mentioned, like in your hangout with like Luke, you talked about fairies, for example. I mean, that would still be agency behind the universe. You're still basically giving the theist somewhat of what he wants. I don't see, it still seems like if you're just positing some sort of material thing that sort of does a lot of the same thing God does, my point is you're still sort of positing basically agency just without calling it God.
Well, yeah, but God doesn't exhaust all time. Okay, so you can have agency that is not omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and that has other different properties that God doesn't have, like is a multiplicity of agents and so forth. So I wouldn't postulate agency, right? But just to talk about the particular example that you gave, sure, you can postulate agency at the basis of reality if you want to. Now, I think that moves you away from reductive materialism, but it doesn't move you towards theism because some type of agency isn't the same as perfect being theology. So I don't see the objection here.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily have to be perfect being theism. I mean, if you posit some sort of like initial quantum state, for example, that sort of just, as you say in your book, like it just simply is. I mean, I forget the exact terminology you used in it, but it's just, it just simply is uncaused. And then it somehow gives rise to the universe by itself. I mean, the basic point is that just basically is describing what would be what theists are getting at. An uncaused first mover that gives rise to the universe. If you just don't want to say
which is not
an agent,
mental, but it's not an agent.
but
According to that example you just gave.
Okay, but it's doing things that mental agents would do, and so why wouldn't it be mental?
Because it's not mental. Just because it's causing the universe doesn't mean that it has to be mental. I mean, unless there's an argument for that, but and some can be given, of course. So I just don't think they're any good.
Well, this just brings me back to one of my first points.
You're saying the effect is the same, so the cause must be same, but that doesn't follow.
Well, this just brings me back to one of my first points about raising the high intellectual price tag. I mean, it does everything an agent does, but it just for some reason isn't an agent.
No, it doesn't do everything the agent does. It does one specific thing, which is cause the universe. So that's the postulate, right? It doesn't do anything else that an agent does, like think, know, believe. It doesn't have any moral like values or consciousness or anything like that. Those are all out. So you can't say that they're the same.
It gives rise, on your view, to moral values. Eventually, gives rise to conscious agents.
Well, not directly. Indirectly, yeah.
Sure, but I mean, you could posit like a timeless Aquinas type view with regards to that, and it should be fine.
Yeah, you could postulate something different, but
yeah,
I mean, we have to compare like with like here. You can't. You're talking about the alleged problem that postulating a timeless quantum state giving rise to the universe is really just God in disguise, and I'm saying nonsense because it has completely different properties to God. It doesn't think, it doesn't know anything. It's not omnibenevolent. It's not a mind in any sense. It doesn't have like perceptions or knowledge. It's completely different type of thing.
Yeah, this just brings me back around to my main point. I mean, it's just, it does things that an agent would do, but for some reason, by brute fact, it lacks all those things, or it just perhaps.
No, because that's not what the hypothesis is. It's not hypothesized to be an agent. It doesn't have the same properties as an agent. It doesn't do any of the things that an agent does. It has one specific effect, that is, it causes the universe in a particular way. Now, God can do anything, right? So literally anything that I postulate, you say, well, God could do that. Well, of course he could. But I think that's the problem with the God hypothesis, because as I said, any outcome, as long as it's logically possible, is equally consistent with the God hypothesis, because God can do anything. I think that's a weakness of the God hypothesis.
I mean, that's like saying because a computer programmer could program a simulation in a way he wants, he cannot be the explanation of a simulation. Just because
no, it would be a bad explanation to just say that. But it's also not true, because a computer program can't just program everything. Like, some things are incomputable, some things would have too much memory to program them, or we wouldn't know how to program them. So I don't think that actually relates to your computer analogy, which I think is
because an agent can do all sorts of different types of simulations, that does not mean the explanation is necessarily bad. Again, we don't need an explanation for the explanation, as you.
No, but it means that it doesn't explain anything. You keep going back to that. An explanation needs to account for why this and not other possibilities. If it doesn't do that, it's not an explanation. It's just a just so story. So if the explanation is equally consistent with all possible outcomes, it is not an explanation.
Again, so like, let's just say there was a paranoid detective who would always posit Ted Bundy as the murderer in the 1970s, for example. I mean, just because Ted Bundy could always be the murderer doesn't mean he was never the murderer.
That's not an analogy. So it would be, well, I can't think of a better example than God, really. Whatever happens, you can say, oh, God did that. Why? Because God can do it, and as far as you know, would do it, right? Of course, you could postulate extra theology. You could postulate extra theology, which say, no, God wouldn't do this particular thing. Now you're getting a bit of explanatory value out of that. But just without any theology, just, okay, he's a perfect being, he can do anything. What's ruled out? But it doesn't seem anything's ruled out, so it can't explain anything. That's what explanations do. Why this, not what anything else it could have been.
But you're not a necessitarian, is it? So you do agree there's a probability of certain possible worlds out there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a wide range of possible worlds, even on your worldview. So I don't see that's how it's a problem here.
You jump in the gun. I'm not talking about why this reality and not others, right? That would be providing an explanation for, like, say, the laws of nature. I don't have an explanation for why the laws of nature are. So, if that's it, then you've got me there. But I don't think you do either, because why did God make these laws of nature in his simulation, not others? You don't have an explanation for that. So we're both on equal footing there.
Right, but I don't need that to posit a mind behind the universe as the most likely explanation given the data I presented.
Well, why do I need that if you need that? Sorry, why do I need that if you don't need that?
I'm not saying that. I'm
okay, well, then that's fine. It's not. Okay. So you keep accusing me of having contingency at the basis of reality, which, I mean, I could appeal to something else that's...
No,
well, then what's the problem? What's the problem with what I'm saying? That God is not a good explanation because he doesn't explain why this and not others. And I'm not just talking about the origin of the laws of nature. I'm talking about literally anything that happens. Because God could make things completely different if he wanted to at any moment in time or any part of the universe. That doesn't follow from naturalism.
Okay, let's go back again. Okay, let's start over here. So you agree there's a huge possibility of all sorts of multiple worlds out there that could have been actualized. There's nothing about this world that means it's necessary. Okay, I'm not accusing
potentially.
You of saying,
I'm not committing myself to that, but yeah, sure, let's go with that.
Yeah, I'm not accusing you of saying that there's contingency at the base of reality. I agree that you could just posit a necessary substance under there. Okay,
sure.
So what I'm trying to get at, though, is you're saying that because God could somehow have done certain things a certain way, that somehow, or different ways, that's a problem for me. But you would also agree there's also this vast probability with regards to the possible worlds out there. So it's the same thing. I don't see why that's a problem for my worldview when it's not a problem for your worldview. It's just slightly different.
No, those I think are equivalent, right? To an extent, right? But the problem is, first of all, the space is larger for God. I mean, they're probably infinite, so it becomes... But God can create immaterial things, whereas I don't think those are possible. But more to the point, once things get going, I think that under naturalism, everything that follows is going to follow from the properties of what exists in reality. Maybe there's some chanciness to quantum events, but that's still describable using very particular laws, right? You can't just have any outcome. Whereas under theism, it seems anything goes, anything at least that's logically possible. So right, I'm not talking about the basis of the laws of nature or whatever. Yeah, okay, we're both going to say that that's contingent and we don't have an explanation for why this one, not the others. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, let's imagine that those have started off, if you like, the Big Bang's happened or whatever. Then what happens after that? I think I have a good explanation for why we see all these regularities in nature, because of all of these scientific theories that we give that describe the underlying properties or regularities of the material stuff that exists. I don't think you can appeal to that because God could just as easily make those not apply at any point in space or any point in time, or have immaterial things pop into being, or miracles. All of that's up for grabs in your worldview, and you don't have explanations for why it happens or doesn't happen at any point in time. I do, because those things are not consistent with the underlying nature of the material reality. So that's where the difference lies, not in the very beginning where these laws come from, but in how they play out.
Right, but I also agree there's regularities that are just not going to change willy-nilly. I don't understand why that's a problem for me. Just because God could do it again, just because there's a possibility doesn't mean
Because if God, no, but yeah,
possible.
but that's the problem, right? No, it is a problem because an explanation needs to say why one outcome and not others, or at least why a set of outcomes is more likely than the broader class. If theistic idealism can't do that, which you seem to say that it can't, then that's a problem. But, I mean, unless you believe that there's no miracles ever and God like never intervenes, in which case it seems that he's not really doing very much. But if there are miracles, then you're going to say, oh, well, God sometimes intervenes, like he sometimes changes things, but then sometimes he doesn't, right?
Well,
Even
I
though he
don't think
could.
miracles are a violation of natural law. I did a whole
Oh,
video
dear.
explaining that's not the case of
I
what's
don't
going
want
on
to get
here.
into that. I don't want to. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if they're
Okay,
a
but
violation of natural law or not. I don't think that's important.
But then that doesn't threaten my view at all, because I'm agreeing there's
It does,
regularities based on
because you need
the
to
way the
explain
universe was
why these
programmed.
outcomes are not others. Again, I feel like we're going in circles here. So
Yeah, I mean, I
I'm
don't
happy
understand why.
I'm happy for you to have the last word on that, but I would like to.
I just don't understand why you think that's a problem for me, because again, we are both arguing the same thing, and that has nothing to do with the foundational entity itself. But I mean, yeah, we can move on if you want to. I mean, we could talk about the Christian things you brought up, as well as that last argument you gave as well, or whatever you want to go to.
Well, we haven't really talked much about the actual digital physics. I guess we've talked about the aspects of theistic idealism, but that's not really the same as the digital physics argument. So I would like to talk a bit about some of the empirical evidence that you outlined in favor of the digital physics argument. So I'm trying to remember, but unfortunately, the different presentations you've given kind of mixed in my mind, so I can't quite remember. Hang on, I did write this down, which ones you mentioned. Maybe I didn't. Did you mention, or would you like to discuss, I guess is the more relevant point, the which one is it? The one where they're looking at the anisotropies in the cosmic microwave background radiation as evidence.
You're talking about the holographic principle.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I brought that up.
Yeah, so that was one of the papers. I think it was. Did I have the? I don't have the authors written down. Yeah. So this is one that you presented a few times before. If I can share my screen here, because I want to show part of this. This one. So just make sure we're talking about the same thing. So these diagrams, right? This is yeah. So hang on, I want to zoom in a bit more. So you presented this paper here as evidence for an emergent universe.
I said it was compatible with cosmological background. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so the data is compatible with the so HC here. That's the that's the holographic principle type arguments about an emergent universe, right? So it's compatible with them. But if that's all we're going to say, then that's not very interesting, because you're advocating. It seems that you were saying there's this evidence for them, not just compatible with them.
I mean, I brought the direct quote from my video that you guys went over in your 8-hour hangout, and I said it's compatible with cosmological observations. And again, as I said in my opening statement, this is not the only argument I've used. The reason why I bring up this study is because before this, we were accused of arguing for the holographic principle, and people were saying it cannot cohere, or it's not compatible with any sort of cosmological observations or any aspect of reality. And this study shows that it can be. So that's one of the reasons I bring up the study. But I mean, the main reason is because it's mainstream physics. It came about from describing the physics of black holes, and all cosmologists studying quantum gravity realize that this is the way forward now, regardless if it's string theory or loop quantum gravity or something else.
Okay, so if you don't want to talk more about that, that's fine. But on the idea that this is mainstream cosmology, I mean, I agree that it is, but you see, we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. So there are, as I said, there are dozens of theories of quantum gravities. Just because a number of physicists are very, like you've quoted a lot from Sean Carroll, for example, he's interested in this sort of approach. That doesn't mean that it is established physics. It just means that it's an interesting area of hypothesis. You appeal to the black hole case, but it is important to distinguish the application of the holographic principle to black holes, to the application of that to the universe as a whole. Those are not the same physical theory, right? One is sort of inspired by the other, but they're not the same. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong. I'm saying that we really don't know. It's very early stage.
Well, I mean, if you're appealing to sort of just like lack of information or could possibly be wrong, my argument would be it's about what is the most probable explanation. And if cosmologists say this is the way forward, that would argue that it's the most probable explanation. And again, as I said in my opening statement, this is one aspect. But I mean, if you're just saying that it could possibly not turn out to be that, well, I mean, sure. I mean, it's possible, but it's a question of what the most up-to-date science is pointing us towards.
But we just don't have the most up-to-date science with respect to quantum gravity. I mean, there's different theories that come in, right? But we don't know. I don't agree when you say that cosmologists are saying this is the way forward. Some are saying that. Others are saying, no, there's other approaches. Like there's so many approaches to quantum gravity. I just think we don't know.
But I mean, but if you let's read work like Leonard Susskind, or you talk to the physicists like I have, they were saying the holographic principle is basically the part of almost all of the ways forward, or the most prominent one's way forward. As far as Leonard Susskind says that holographic principle is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. So I don't see why this somehow gets around the issue here. Because yeah, it's not necessarily a full picture of quantum gravity. I've never said that it was, but it's part of the path forward going. It's what most physicists say is a basic feature of our reality at this point. So, I mean, I don't see what the issue is with that then. I mean, sure, it's possible like tomorrow we could find out like the theory of evolution is wrong, but based on the most up-to-date data, we tend to say that that's where the path forward is.
Yeah, but that's the false analogy there. The holographic principle or quantum cosmology is nowhere near the position of established science that theory of evolution is. But look, I'm happy enough to say, look, it's a plausible candidate, and if that's and many physicists are interested in going in this.
Most physicists agree, they believe in the holographic
So you haven't
principle
substantiated that. You've quoted a few physicists. Look, I'm not working in this area. I actually have a friend who is, right? So I know that there is a lot of work here. Are most physicists in quantum gravity? I have no idea. Like a bunch are, I know that. Are most? I don't know. Like Leonard Susskind thinks it's the way forward. Sean Carroll does. So okay, there's a lot of people who think it is.
Juan Maldacena, the guy you quoted at one point in your 8-hour hangout, that big long article, he's the one who basically put forward the paper that showed that it's mathematically the way forward at this point.
Wait, which paper was that?
There was a Scientific American article on the illusion of gravity. Juan Maldacena.
Oh, that article was terrible. Anyway, we don't have to get into that. It was just really misleading. The fact that gravity is emergent doesn't mean it's an illusion. It's maybe more the headline I'm reacting to.
I do want to talk about that. I mean, it's just
sure.
It seems like it's just like an equivocation fallacy by what people mean by illusion. It seems just because it seems like we're just defining the term differently. And if he's defining the term differently than you, I don't see how that means that articles.
Well, how would you define illusion? Did you want to say gravity is an illusion, or space-time is an illusion, or would you prefer a different term?
What I mean by that in my videos is it's not something like a naive realist would say, that it's just something that maybe like Aristotle or like Plato would have understood. It's just a fundamental aspect of reality. It's just something that's emergent. And that's what, when you quote like Juan Maldacena or you talk to Leonard Susskind, that's when they use those terms, that's kind of what they mean. They don't mean like it's like
not real
from a magic show. Yeah, they don't mean not
Which
real.
is what most people would mean when they say illusion, not real or fake.
Okay, but I'm going on I'm using the same terminology that, like.
Yeah, but they're just popularizing that. Like that's it's really misleading, because the reason I object to that is because physicists popularize things badly all the time. I don't have a problem with saying that, right? Especially at the heading of a Scientific American article. Like none of these theories say that gravity is an illusion in the way you would normally understand that term. They say it's emergent, right? In the same way that that temperature is emergent, or that weather and life are emergent, that they're not fundamental constituents of reality.
Right, and I think that's all
just
an
important. Okay, that's fine, but that's an important distinction to make, because I think that I think some of your videos are misleading about this in making it seem more mysterious than it really is.
Okay, well, I would just say you're getting nitpicky over terminology.
No, it's not nitpicky at all, because it's about how these ideas are presented to the public who don't have as much background to understand this. And when it's presented as being an illusion, then I think that is making it more difficult to understand than it really needs to be. It's about deriving from more fundamental principles in physics.
Well, luckily my videos aren't 10 seconds long where I go, gravity's an illusion, bye. I give a lot more details explaining what I mean by those.
Okay, well, that's fine. Okay, so one thing I want to mention though, okay, so we disagree a little bit about how maybe preeminent emergent theories are in physics, but we both agree that they're increasingly prominent, and they're at least a plausible candidate, maybe the only candidate, but whatever. I don't want to get too caught up on that. What I want to ask though is, and I think that this is sort of one of the key points there, how are these emergent gravity or emergent space-time models evidence for your view, or like theistic idealism or something like that?
Okay,
I guess this is the first premise, I think. Okay,
so the basic idea is that if you take like the naive realist position, the idea that sort of like there's a actual material reality beyond our experiences, built particles or some sort of underlying substance, space and time as we experience them, that's actually the way reality is. The idealist has said that's just simply not the case. Idealism has argued that these are sort of like features of a bundled sort of reality that are contingent upon mind. So it's not that like a substance dualist would say we have this spirit realm and we have the physical realm, and the spirit sort of interacts in this physical world, that kind of thing. No, we would say that is all just sort of contingent upon mind. And if the scientific theories are pointing to this idea that what we experience is also something that is actually not fundamental as we experience it. That would support an idealist ontology, because as I was talking about in my opening statement, we perceive as reality seems to emerge from underlying abstractions, mathematics, basically what we're seeing from an ontic structural realist position. So we're not actually seeing this picture of like some sort of material reality that, you know, we are either built from or that we are sort of interacting with in sort of like a dualist setting. It just seems to be emergent from sort of mathematics, the same thing John Wheeler is sort of talking about.
So I'll mention a couple of models that I'm familiar with. So when Sean Carroll talks about the emergence of space and time from quantum mechanics, so his model is basically grounding space and time, or the emergence of space and time in entanglement, where he's saying essentially that the more entangled systems are, then essentially the closer they are in space and time to each other. So that's, I mean, in very, very abbreviated terms, that's how he thinks about that. One of the other physicists that you quote is Fontini Marcopoli.
Don't even try. It's very long name.
Yeah. So she appears in a few of your videos, and I read up a bit on what she thinks. And her idea is sort of similar, but a bit different. She talks about this, what she calls micromatter, which it seems to be a bit under theorized as to exactly what that is. But she talks about how the emergence of space and gravity in particular comes out as a basically a low energy state of the system, where basically everything starts off as highly interconnected and non-local, so that all sort of parts of the universe are like bundled up together and like connected in some way. But then at a low energy limit, they sort of separate out, and you get the locality as we have. Again, very, very crude explanation there. But the point is, so those are just two examples, right? There's also the holographic principle, the CDF correspondence argument, which looks at the relationship between conformal field theories and string theories on the boundary of a surface. All of those different models, which are just some of the emergent ones, none of them say that like space or time or gravity emerge from a mind. They're saying that it emerges from some micro quantum state, or from the quantum entanglement, or something like that. So this is the issue with the interpretation of the theories, right? Obviously, the theories themselves need to be interpreted, so there's some issues there, and it's early stages. But I don't see how you get to emerging from a mind from any of this.
I mean, so take your long-hour hangout. You mentioned that a lot of this stuff physicists don't really talk about because that's not what they necessarily do. Yeah, I mean, this is a realm of philosophy. I just disagree with their underlying philosophical views. That's fine, but I'm still missing the link. That's not misinterpreting their theories. That's me saying I think this is a far more parsimonious explanation than what you're positing. So, I mean, I'm not really positing anything at this point. I'm saying that the content of the theory is, let's say Sean Carroll, the content of his theory, again, crudely, is to my understanding, is reducing like the emergence of space-time to quantum entanglement, right? That's the content of his theory. Now, we can interpret that and say, what does that mean, like ontologically, philosophically? But so what's the argument to get a mind out of that? It seems to me like, let me be clear here. You can advocate for theistic idealism without any appeal to these quantum gravity theories, right? So like you could do that just entirely on philosophical grounds. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying why theistic idealism at this point. I'm just saying, what does it have to do with emergent gravity? I think that's the fundamental block I have. I don't see how it's connected. I'm quoting Carroll or the other physicist with the ginormous name, I'm not quoting their whole theory. I'm quoting points of agreement. So it's like I did in my Irreducible Minds series. When I'm quoting physicalists, I'm quoting points of agreement. I'm not endorsing the whole theory. I'm not saying they endorse my theory. I'm just quoting points of agreement, like people often do.
The agreement being that space-time aren't fundamental?
Yeah, space-time not fundamental. That's it. And then I'm talking about my philosophical inferences from there. Just because I quote someone doesn't mean I'm entirely in agreement with them on every single detail.
Well, no, obviously, but this isn't every single detail. This is literally the content of what they're talking about when they say, space and time is not fundamental. They don't mean it in anything like the way that you seem to mean it.
We have different philosophical inferences. But
completely different inferences.
But we're agreeing on the data point itself. Okay, just because, like, for example, Daniel Dennett can quote other various philosophers of mind or neuroscientists, that doesn't mean when he quotes like a neuroscientist, that neuroscientist necessarily agrees with his entire philosophical view. He's referencing a point of agreement on that one specific issue. So, for example, if I were debating let's say a flat earther, and I'd say, well, James Fodor for once upon a time did this video where he debunked it and he said this and whatnot. I'm not saying we entirely agree. I'd be pointing to a point of agreement on a specific data point.
Okay,
so,
that's fine. Let me ask you this then. Let's suppose that emergent space-time, emergent gravity models were somehow disproven. Like they're all bunk. And let's suppose we had to postulate, space-time is a fundamental constituent of reality. Again, just as a thought experiment, would that be evidence against your views?
If it was positive, I would say it would definitely turn, and using the language of Emery Lakatos, I would say it would probably lead more to a degenerate research program, because now there's more I need to explain away. So I would say yes, considering that I am a scientific realist, and I do think that when we study science, we're discovering the way reality actually is. I do feel like that would push me maybe in a different direction, because as you said last week, you're trying to go where the science leads you, and I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, but that's a fine answer, but I still don't quite understand. So maybe you can help me here. So under your view, everything that is the material world is ultimately a simulation or emergent from God's mind, right? So let's suppose that space-time, we found out that it's not just like quantum fields or particles or whatever. You need space-time as well, like they're separate. One doesn't emerge from the other. So let's suppose we found that out, right? Wouldn't you just say, well, it turns out that there are these two things that God has in his mind that are part of the simulation. One doesn't emerge from the other in the simulation. They're just these two different things. I don't see how that's actually evidence against what you're saying. It's just, it's all still in God's mind. Like it all seems to fit there. What am I missing here?
Well, I mean, it just seems like you're just appealing to the metaphysical. Like, of course, there's always a way to explain something away. But I mean, like,
but your theory is a metaphysical theory. It's not a scientific theory,
right?
So what's the problem?
Just like materialism. I mean, I don't understand what you're getting at here, though. I mean, if we found out space and time are fundamental, I mean,
here's what I'm getting at. It seems to me that any scientific finding at all is consistent with your theory. That's what I'm getting at.
Well, I mean, that could be the same with your view then. I mean, that could be the same with your view then.
Maybe, but if so, it would be a weakness of my view, but I don't think it is true. But we're not interrogating my view. We're interrogating the digital physics argument. So I don't want to change the subject here. If my view is bunk, then my view is bunk. But that doesn't mean the digital physics argument is a sound argument.
Look, I think
I'm asking, do scientific findings support what you're saying? And I don't think that they do, because any scientific finding, it seems to me, would be equally consistent with theistic idealism.
Well, I mean, you just admitted it would be the same with materialism.
No, I didn't. I said, suppose that it would. That would undermine, that would mean that I have problems as well. But that's just a two quoque. Like you're just saying, well, you as well. Like, well, so what? We're talking about the digital physics argument. I'd love to come on and then you can critique me on my reductive naturalism. But we have to focus on one thing at a time.
Well, I think this is a good point. There's a great paper written by two atheists called The Cognitive Appeal of the Cosmological Argument. They bring up your favorite person, William Lane Craig, so you probably enjoy it. But I mean, we know you've called him drunk at night going, why can't I quit you, Billy? So, but I mean, I feel like this is a difference here, is that one of the things they point out in the paper, and I think they do get some things wrong, but one of the things I think that is really important about the paper is they point out there's a kind of a cognitive difference here. Theists, we're trying to look for what is the most probable given the data, and atheists are willing to accept that maybe we don't have enough data to make that inference, and there's all these other possibilities out there. I mean, so this relates to kind of what you're bringing up, that sure, with a metaphysical worldview, you can always interpret data in certain ways to fit with it, but then it's going to become a question with regards to parsimony. If I found out that like space and time were fundamental, there's more things I would need to explain away to fit with my metaphysical view, and it's going to hinder it in that direction. So yeah, I agree that any materialist, idealist, dualist could always explain data, but just because explaining data does not mean it's the most probable explanation. It's about that's about probability, not just all those sorts of possibilities out there. So I don't see what that has to do with anything here.
Okay, that's fine. So more could be said about that, but I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the theological points that I raised. If you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great tradition with regards to this whole is God sinful if we're simulating in the mind of God? I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Greek Orthodox Church has been panentheistic for a very long time.
I did not know that.
Yeah, weak panentheism is what they goes back to Gregory Palamas, Maximus the Confessor, even building on Clement of Alexandria. There's a theologian, Callistos Ware, who's sort of presented a lot of this, but it's weak panentheism. So yeah, Christian tradition has been long been associated with.
Wait, what does that mean? Weak panentheism?
So it's not like Hegel's strong panentheism, but sort of like we're part of like the essence of God, like we're part of God's mind, like evolving, he's learning more in that kind of sense. So they note something called the essence-energy distinction. And in scripture, for example, we see this tension between the immanence and transcendence of God, and that's explained through the energy-essence distinction. So we would say we are emerging from the energies of God, and we're not emerging from his transcendent essence. So that's how we would explain that. There's a lot more to be said on that, but I mean, like, when I heard that argument, my immediate thought was just to go to that, and I didn't really say that it's too much of an issue. I forget what your second argument was.
I didn't think you would think that it was. I just wanted to, maybe I'll just comment briefly that doesn't really make any sense to me and seems a bit ad hoc. I'm not saying that you should agree with that. That's just this could be a whole other debate, right? I'm not pretending to know that much about Greek Orthodox theology. But I wanted to present these just to clarify why I present them, because there appear to be tensions between what you're saying and what I've understood Christian Orthodoxy to be, and many Christians have. Now, maybe you disagree with them on certain points. Maybe there's ways you have a I don't know, but I just wanted to bring those out a bit. So that's fine. Now, you asked what the second point was, and the second point was that it seems to me, excuse me, oh dear, I got a bit hoarse. It seems to me that some of what you were saying could be used as to undercut classical cosmological arguments. Yeah,
I mean, so I don't hold to Craig's A theory of time. I don't hold to that at all. So I've never, people have noticed, I've never done a video on the Kalam really, per se. I mean, I may have mentioned it here and there, but no, I'm not a proponent of that. And as you even say in your book on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, it's time independent. So I don't think it undermines every cosmological argument, but I just feel like the theistic idealist path forward is more consistent with the data. We don't have to posit, Craig's view of time or anything like that. And this is just a better worldview than like that sort of issue. So no, I have no issue with that.
Okay, well, that's fine. I just thought, that was an interesting implication. Maybe I could ask briefly about the incarnation. So, I mean, I'm sure you'll have something to say about this. I'm just sort of curious. So let me try to articulate the question. So if God comes into reality as Jesus, he's fully God and fully man, how does that work under, I mean, I don't really understand how that works under a more mainstream view, but under your view, it seems that like God is the mind underpinning the simulation, but then how can that mind enter into his own simulation? It's like he's inside himself. That seems to be particularly bizarre. So like, how do you understand that?
Well, it just is Jesus entering the simulation as sort of like an avatar in that sense. I mean, I don't see why that would be an issue.
Well, let me clarify. Yeah, so you could think of him as being an avatar. Why it seems to me to be an issue there is that at least the Christians I've spoken to would describe, and again, I don't pretend to be an expert on theology, but would say that Jesus was fully God and fully man, not just he was an avatar of God. That appears to be a much stronger claim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, like, he still is fully God from the essence who's now entering into a human avatar. I'm not just saying he's just the avatar of God. I'm saying that it is actually third person of the Trinity entering.
I feel like it's probably not going to go. Maybe I'll just Maybe I'll just then ask it one more time. So how can God's mind, like his full essence, enter into? Sorry. Let me rephrase that. How can God, his full essence, enter into a simulation in his own mind? That seems to be like saying that me, like not just an idea of me or a projection of me, but like actually me enters into my own dream or something like, or my own thoughts. That doesn't seem to make sense.
You do enter into your own dream.
No, but actually me, not just an idea of me. My substance or essence or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I mean, I think like you're sort of assuming this sort of like materialist outlook to sort of like debunk it. And we would say that no, you're not the essence of what you are there physically. That's just a representation of you. So, I mean, like the actual essence of God, the actual essence of Christ is just sort of entering into the simulation, sort of like how an avatar would. I don't see why that's an issue. It doesn't, I guess I'm not getting what you're actually trying to say there.
Okay, look, that's fine. This is for a theologian to discuss. I still find that a bit problematic, but I just wanted to ask about that. That's all. Okay. So if there's any, I don't know if we're on to like question time or if there's anything you wanted to ask of me. I'm not sure where we're going for time at the moment.
There was plenty of questions. I don't know how much time we need to get to them. I mean, I don't know how Nathan if I would have time to go through a lot of this stuff here.
If you want some time to throw these questions across at James, I guess we can go into the Q&A time, and just cut that a little bit shorter if that would be okay.
Yeah, because I feel like if I'm gonna go into more, this can take another 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay. If we go then, how about if we do 20 minutes?
I gotta leave in like 40 minutes at the latest. So I don't have, if we want to do a Q&A, like I got to get going soon.
Okay.
I can give quick answers if there's particular things that are burning, Michael, or if
it's more about going back to underlying foundational issues, things Graham Oppie brings up, things like that, or things you bring up in your book, but I feel like that would take too long to develop.
Well, I guess, I mean, it doesn't have to be here, but in future, if you want, like James said before, if you wanted to kind of like flip the script and then it could be like a kind of critique of something that James kind of puts forward in his worldview, maybe from your position, if you wanted to do that at some point in future.
Some point,
yeah.
I'm booked up for the summer now, and then school starts up, and I'm just
right. Yeah. So maybe we could do that. Is there like one key objection that you want to get out there to what James has had to say, and then he can respond to that, just so there's a bit of.
Let me see here. Well, we covered actually some of this. Now that I think about it, I mean, my issues would just be going back to regarding fundamental ontology at the base of reality. With regards to that, if we want to go back into that, but I feel like we might just start going in circles again. But I mean, let's just
probably
go to
said
Q&A.
What I can say in this format about that.
Let's just go to Q&A. I don't want to keep beating a dead horse.
Okay, sure. So the super chats have now scrolled off my screen, but I took them down in a sticky note. So Sentinel Apologetics. I'm not sure if this is even so much question, but it was a $10 super chat. So he says, it's ironic that quantum theory flirts with early philosophy of reality. Plato on our reality is a shadow of the perfect hidden forms. A basketball is round and orange, but the idea of it is neither. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that, but it's not so much a question.
I don't see the super chats. Are they supposed to come on the screen?
Yeah, I've lost them on the StreamYard thing, so unfortunately I can't actually pop it up right now.
Yeah, no worries.
So that seems to be saying something about like universals, that what was it? The color of orange is not the same as the orange or something like that?
Yeah, the idea of the basketball, I think, was...
the basketball, sorry. I don't know where I got orange from.
Round. Yeah, oh, no, he did say round and orange, but the idea isn't round or orange.
Oh, yeah, right. Look, that's an interesting question about, the nature of universals and ideals and so on. I don't know that there's anything I can say that will be insightful in that time. Other than, yes, interesting topic for discussion.
And then Sentinel Projects put in another super chat where he says, Eccles held to dualistic interactionism, that if our brain works according to physical laws, and if microtubules create an entangled quantum system within cells, then our actions are not determinable. Again, more of a statement, but I don't know if either of you want to comment on that point.
Yeah, Eccles talks about that in his book a lot. He's more of a dualist in there, but I tend to disagree with him, although I presented his ideas as at least plausible for dualism in the past.
Anything you want to say on that one, James, or are you happy to?
Yeah, I don't agree with dualist conceptions of the mind, but I've talked a lot about that in some of my videos, so I don't think we need to get into that here.
There was a question for you, James, based on how you would explain the difference between brute and contingent facts. And I'm not sure, again, if you want to kind of come back on what James has to say after as well, Michael, to see if you're in agreement or disagreement there.
Well, I'm basically just following Oppie's usage here. So Oppie distinguishes a brute fact from a contingent fact. Well, maybe I should actually talk about all three. So there's a necessary, brute, and contingent, as far as I understand it. So something that's necessary means that it could not have been otherwise, is the only way it could have been, like maybe mathematical facts or something like that, or God's existence or non-existence. So that's true in every possible world, or pertains in every possible world. But then there's two types of non-necessary facts, which are brute and contingent. So as I understand it, a contingent fact is one that could have been otherwise, but has some explanation for why it was the way that it was. So most effects in causal reality, well, actually, depends if quantum mechanics is fundamentally random or not, but at least classically, let's say, to bracket that question, most effects in the causal world are thought to be contingent. That is, it could have been otherwise. Mount Everest could have been higher or lower, or someone else could have been won the election or whatever. But there's like causes or reasons for why they are the way they are. So they're explained but contingent. Whereas a brute fact, as Oppie uses it, is something that's contingent but unexplained. It just is the way it is, and there's no further reason. So what you'd want to do is minimize the number of brute facts in your ontology, right? Because they're just unexplained. And I guess my criticism is that it seems that free choices on the part of God are all brute facts, and actually under theistic idealism, everything is almost, well, not God's nature, but everything that he decides to do is a brute fact.
Yeah, and my reply would be no, those would be contingent facts. Those are not necessarily brute facts. The brute facts with regards to the fundamental entity and why things are the certain way they are. But I don't think thoughts necessarily are going to be, the way a mind could think is not necessarily going to be a brute fact in and of itself. That's just a contingent state of affairs. Doesn't necessarily follow that would be a brute fact.
Sure. So the next question then, if we move on, is for inspiring philosophy. How can you say that quantum fields aren't physical substrates when we can measure physical effects they have in reality? And then they said, here's an example, the Casimir effect.
Yeah, well, we can measure things that happen in physical reality, but I mean, once again, the philosophers of scientists note that a lot of that is sort of just explaining certain ways certain relations are without any sort of appeal to a substance down there. I mean, we're assuming that there's got to be some sort of like substance or some sort of objects that we're sort of relating. But I mean, as Meinrad Kuhlmann notes, science works just well without there actually being that kind of thing. And a lot of what we're experiencing is just sort of like these emergent type effects from underlying information that's sort of processing and whatnot. It doesn't necessarily follow that necessarily has to be a substance, given, you could make the analogy I was talking earlier with this computer simulation or whatnot. I mean, you could have a simulation where there's like some sort of like Casimir effect happening in a computer, but that doesn't mean there has to be like little bits of particles that are bouncing around in that simulated world for there actually to be the effect. Likewise, there doesn't necessarily need to be that kind of substance for the effect in our type of world. You can have it with an idealist ontology and it works just fine.
Is there anything you want to add to that, James?
Yeah, again, I don't think it's satisfactory to be a conventionalist or an instrumentalist about scientific theories, because I think the no miracles argument is a good argument. Basically, the no miracles argument says, look, if the theories are so successful, then why are they so successful? Is it just like a coincidence? And the idea is, no, it's not a coincidence. They're describing something that's like really real or really exists in reality. Now, there is a further question about what is it that they're describing? What is the nature of it? And Michael and I talked before about structural realism and different models there. I think there needs to be some sort of physical substance or substrate or something to and we're describing the properties or behaviors of that. But we've sort of been through that.
Okay. And then, so there's a question for you here, James, that says, like Craig says, how can a timeless state give rise to an effect other than the idea that there is agent causation with free will?
Oh boy, this is really a whole other discussion. Well, largely separate discussion. Look, agent causation is a particular model of causation which says that there can be a relationship between a substance and an event, which is causal. So a substance can cause an event, particularly a mental substance like a mind, can cause an event timelessly. That is a highly contested model of causation. I don't think it works. But all you need is a different model of causation, which explains how you can get a temporal effect, like an event, from some sort of timeless cause. And indeed, you can even use substance event causation. You just have to change the substance. So it could be, for example, that according to emergent theories of quantum gravity, that a timeless, because time is emergent, so the underlying quantum substrate is timeless and gives rise to space and time and like the beginning of the universe, like a Big Bang something. As a cause and effect relationship, that would be a different type of causation, or maybe instantiation of causation, than the sort of event causation we typically see within, the physical universe. But that would be one model of it, right? And of course, you could give other models as well. There are actually lots of competing theories about how to understand the metaphysics of causation and what that would look like. But the short answer is just that you give a theory of causation that explains how you can have a timeless cause and a temporal effect, and then you evaluate that theory on the basis of its explanatory virtues. Agent causation is just one such model, and it doesn't mean it's the only one. I mean, certain theists may say that it is, but I just think that's wrong.
Would you like to say anything on that point, Michael?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there was a timeless entity that gave rise to space and time. I just see that as seems kind of just odd to just refer to that as just the way it is, as like a brute fact, without it referring to an agent. It just seems like it's, if it's doing things an agent does, it just seems more likely that it is an agent, and that's why I appeal to that from multiple areas on that. But I mean, that's just where James and I are going to disagree.
So there's a question here from Greyback, which says, for IP, would you debate the resurrection with Camille Gregor? And if not, why? Can I ask here? Yeah,
read my pinned Twitter post, and then that should give you some explanation as to why I don't really feel like talking to him right now.
And then, so we've kind of caught up in the chat with the Q&A, so I should be able to put them up on screen now. So the One Gamer says, question for IP. I think an idea that James was hinting at earlier is a theory that explains everything, explains nothing. Thoughts on this when discussing God's existence?
A theory that explains everything explains nothing. I guess I would need more clarification, because we would want a theory that explains more and not less. I mean, again, I think the difference is regarding those, regarding what we would define as a brute fact. But I mean, I would need a little more context to get what he's trying to get at here.
And then the scrolly thing is not working very well for me today. We have a question from Pine Creek, who says he just wants to know if sin is in the mind of God or not. So I guess that's regarding the criticism of the idealistic picture in the theology.
Yeah, I would refer to the energy essence distinction. It would be not in the essence of God.
And then let me see if we've got any more as I'm scrolling down. Lots of chat, but not a lot of questions at this point. Oh, here we go. Here's one for IP. If God's thoughts are contingent on his nature and not brute facts, would that not imply God acts deterministically and not on non-compatibilist free will?
God's thoughts are contingent on his nature. Well, yeah, they're contingent on, but not brute facts. I mean, I'd imply that God acts deterministically and not. Well, no, not necessarily, because I mean, they would be contingent actions and not necessarily going to be necessary actions. So I don't really see how the connection is sort of there. I mean, that doesn't mean that he's got to necessarily do certain things the way they are. So I don't see how that's going to follow from that.
So can I ask about this, Michael? So would you affirm that God has libertarian free will?
Depends on what. Let's be clear how we sort of define those types
Sure.
of things. By compatibilism, you would say that someone has free will because they're compatible with their neural workings, the brain, their history, all that sort of things right now.
With their choices being caused, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, we would have to say God is libertarian free will because he's not some sort of physical agent in that kind of sense. So it's not like he's compatible with some sort of like physical nature.
Yeah, well, you could also say he doesn't have free will. I think that would be non-standard, but I was just clarifying. So, so the reason I think that's relevant is because I think libertarian free will poses a lot of problems for explanations, because it seems that again, I don't expect you to agree with this, but it seems to me that libertarian free will basically says that any free decision is a brute fact. That is, there's no explanation as to why this choice was made rather than another choice. It's just that's what they chose. And so if everything is a free choice of God, because it's all, in his mind, then that's sort of another way to look at what I was saying before, that we can't really explain why anything is the way that it is, because it's all freely chosen by God, which means that it's a brute fact. There's no explanation for it.
Okay, but then that relates also back to your view. So just to sort of compare, to sort of explain where I'm coming from, I'm not trying to put your view on trial. I'm just sort of trying to explain your analogy. I mean, you would agree that there's not a necessary universe as is. There's a whole probability in the way that certain laws are the way they are, just are certain brute facts and whatnot. So the current contingent state of affairs just appeals to the same sort of underlying probability in that sort of sense. It doesn't have to appeal to, this. It doesn't have to necessarily be an explanation on either view, because that's just sort of the thing, the way certain things are.
Yeah, so I'll just reiterate what I said before about this. Yeah, so with respect to like why the laws of nature are the way they are or something like that, I agree that I don't have an explanation for that, just as the theist doesn't. I think the difference is that, once that gets going, so to speak, within the causal law of reality of nature, I don't think that they're brute. Well, there might be quantum, I don't know, but at least they're not any libertarian brute facts of that sort. Whereas it seems that there are, in fact, it seems all that there is under your view are those sorts of things, which I think is the difference. But again, we've talked about that already, so.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Danny has asked, do you think God is falsifiable? It seems like you would be committed to the fact that he is, since you're appealing to empirical contingent observations to confirm his existence. I guess that's more for you, Michael, and then if you want to comment, James.
I don't think God would be falsifiable in the strong sense, but you could say that perhaps the theistic worldview could become a degenerate research program over time. Like if you could find out that, if you could have started explaining some of the arguments for God's existence in more parsimonious ways, then yeah, you would slowly start to have a degenerate research program, and it would just become, a unfalsifiable worldview, but it would just posit too much. So I don't think it's falsifiable in the strong sense, but I mean,
Can I ask about that, Michael? Because I think that's interesting. You're using the notion of degenerative research programs. I think that's Lakatos, isn't it? So he talked about the idea that you can't like straightforwardly falsify a scientific theory, but over time there's more and more puzzles and anomalies that crop up that it fails to explain. It becomes more ad hoc, and eventually something better comes
I'm
along.
just borrowing the language from
Yeah. So there's just something I mean, I'm not saying that's itself problematic. I just wanted to ask whether you would see theism, or maybe at least certain brands of theism, as a research program like that, because it seems that theism far predates anything that we would regard as even like a philosophical research program, it seems that it just seems that it's quite a different thing, that people believe in God for and have believed in God for lots of reasons that are quite separate from a research program. Maybe you're happy with that and saying, yeah, but we're now using it as a research program. I'm just curious as to how you see that fitting together.
I guess I'm not really sure what you're trying to get at. I mean, yeah, people believe.
Well, it doesn't
in God
seem
for
that
all sorts of
theism is
things.
exactly a research program. It seems like it derives from religious beliefs that people hold. Rather, it's not like that's just not true for a lot of, I think, most scientific views that our research programs do address particular physical phenomena. They don't emerge because people have religious commitments or other sort of metaphysical commitments to things. They just seem quite different beasts, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing where you're getting at, because we all have metaphysical commitments and sort of that sort of sense.
But do those drive particular scientific research? Maybe some of them do. Like maybe there's certain very politically motivated ones you could point out. But look, anyway, it doesn't really matter. I was just curious about that. We don't have to.
Okay, yeah.
So there's a question here for you, James, which says, what are your thoughts on Richard Swinburne and his approach to theism as an explanation, which for those who sort of aren't aware, I guess it's this idea of personal versus scientific explanation, and a personal explanation being simpler than a scientific one for the natural laws, for example.
Yeah, that's a good question. I need to read more of Swinburne. I've only interacted with him to a relatively modest extent. With respect to the point that you just mentioned, Nathan, I don't accept the distinction, or at least not the fundamental distinction, between agentic and like scientific or physical causations. I think that agentic explanations are a subset or a special derived type of physical explanations, of course, because I'm a reductive naturalist, right? But look, to fully answer that question, you'd have to really dig into like, what is an explanation and what is a good explanation supposed to do? And I think that I've kind of already hinted at that. Libertarian free will, I don't think can ever be fundamentally a good explanation, because it just leaves the decision as a brute fact. So I don't think that you actually get very far on that sort of program. But that's not a satisfactory refutation of Swinburne or anything. That's just some initial thoughts. But yeah, I need to do more reading of Swinburne.
Do you want to comment on your thoughts on Swinburne's distinction there, Michael?
You
happy to move on? It's up to you.
I'm happy to move on. People want more to deal with criticism for Swinburne. The paper I refer to by Brian Leftow, he deals with a lot of that.
And so one again for you, Michael, which is what do you find of Allah in the metaphysical essence? I'm guessing, I mean, it's not quite clear what they're asking, but I mean, I guess it's along the lines of why couldn't idealism be consistent with Allah, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's consistent with a lot of different religious views. I would never argue from theistic idealism to Christianity. As I said, that's why I started by noting in the beginning, for the commenter, that I'm a classical apologist. We don't start with the idea that we don't start with like a precept would. We don't start by just saying that we have to assume the Christian worldview or anything. We start by arguing for a theistic worldview and then argue for Christianity after that.
Awesome. So we've probably got time for 5 to 10 minutes more of Q&A, by the way, guys. So I'm just going to keep going through these for that time, and then I'll wrap it up. So a question for James. Why is the fact that a theory explains everything a problem as long as it's backed with evidence, explanatory power and scope, falsifiable, etc.?
Well, this is just going to get us right back into the same difficulty we've been at. Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, right? Let me try to articulate what I'm saying here again. So the problem with the theory that explains everything is that, understood in a particular way, which I'll get to, is that it necessarily lacks explanatory power and scope. So what do I mean by that? Explanatory power and scope, as I understand it, is the ability to outline or explain, state why this, as opposed to all of the possibilities. So why do we see this outcome instead of all of the other things that may have happened or could have happened as far as we know? That's what an explanation is supposed to do. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to reduce it to like one certain outcome and everything else ruled out. It could be probabilistic, right? It could say we expect this class of outcomes out of the broader, like subclass out of a broader class, right? But it needs to do that, at least probabilistically, if it's to have any explanatory power at all. That's what I think an explanation is. Now, what is the problem with the theory that explains everything? Well, by explain everything here, I mean is equally consistent with all possible outcomes. that means you can just tell a story about whatever happens, like, yes, well, I explained that with da-da-da, or with da-da-da, and it's the same thing each time. That's the problem. If essentially what you say is that the theory is able to explain whatever happens, then it doesn't actually explain anything, because it's equally consistent. Your explanation, your postulate is could equally well fit whatever actually happens. So it's not able to distinguish certain possibilities out of the broader class. And that's precisely what I think an explanation needs to do. Now, good scientific theories are able to do this because they say, look, we could observe or experimentally find many, many different results, but our theories are going to say that only a small range of results are going to be consistent with what we've said. And that's how we falsify, at least in a weak sense, falsify a hypothesis or theory when we don't see what we expect to see. Now, my problem with theism is broadly, it doesn't really seem to rule much of anything out, or very little out. And in that sense, it seems to explain everything and thereby explain nothing. That's the basic idea.
So does a materialist worldview, would it be compatible with a whole number of possible worlds? I mean, like, you could always explain
materialism per se does rule out some things. It rules out immaterial minds. But materialism per se doesn't rule out very much. No, you need a lot more. That's where science comes in, right?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the connection there, because I feel like it's a metaphysical worldview in itself, and it could be compatible with all sorts of number of possible worlds.
Yeah, but it depends on what you're using a particular postulate to do. So if I'm using materialism as a postulate to rule out immaterial minds, then that's a prediction that's made, and I think is verified. I don't think we observe immaterial minds. But then you wouldn't say that the fact that that's consistent with all sorts of theories of, like, I don't know, gravity or morality or whatever else. Like, well, that's a separate point. Like, because a theory is not explaining things it's not designed to, is not an argument against the theory. It's what are you advancing it to do? Does it have explanatory power over what it's attempting to explain?
But we're talking about overall metaphysical worldviews, not specific scientific theories.
Right. Well, then that becomes, because you can't say I don't think it would be fair to say materialism is overall worldview, because no one's just going to say they're a materialist, end of story. A whole worldview has to answer a lot more questions than that, or at least I would take it to. So it's not going to be materialism versus non-materialism. It's going to be, your particular set of beliefs versus mine, and then we'd assess those on the basis of what they explain.
So with a theist, they're not going to be all sorts of different varieties of theists, just like you said. There's all different.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I'm saying. So when you're talking about a theory, this is what I think Oppie talks about. He talks about theory as a well worked out set of propositions that covers, like, ideally kind of everything, or at least a wide range of phenomena. If you just take one question like materialism, well then, yeah, it's going to be consistent with a very wide range of outcomes. But here's how I'd phrase it. A theory does not have explanatory power with respect to phenomena that it does not attempt to explain. I mean, maybe it happens to accidentally, but in general, it's not going to. So materialism doesn't have explanatory power with respect to a whole wide range of questions, but it may have explanatory power with respect to certain subsets of questions, like the existence of material or versus immaterial minds. The fact that it doesn't have explanatory power with respect to other things doesn't count against it with respect to the particular things it's supposed to be explaining. The problem is when a theory has no explanatory power with respect to anything that it's trying to explain. That's when I think you have an issue.
Do you want to come back on that point, Michael, or do you think that's a good place?
I mean, I feel like I'm going to open up a can of worms if I keep going.
There's a lot of disagreement in that area. So again, that might be one for sort of discussion going forward. There's a question here from a super chat from Myth Vision podcast. So thank you. And he asks, IP, what would it take you to convince? What would it take to convince you that God is not the most probable? Look, I've completely butchered that. What would it take to convince IP that it's most probable God doesn't exist? There we go.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, there's many ways you could start to chip away at that. I mean, an eternal universe where space and time is fundamental is one way to start going with that. You could also start to falsify any sort of scientific evidence we would have for idealism. Finding hidden variables, for example, would be a big thing for me. So something along those types of nature. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways. It really would depend on where the scientific data is sort of pointing in that sort of sense. And so, you could start to verify, like, let's say we could get beyond quantum field theory, we could find some sort of underlying material objects or substance that are just sort of there, verify they're sort of necessary or, whatnot. I mean, that would start to chip away that kind of stuff as well. So, I mean, I would say I'm not going to be very much convinced from a substance dualist perspective on theism. I do feel I agree with Graham Oppie when it comes to that. I feel like an idealistic ontology, though, is a little bit more superior, though. So
I'm going to flip this question around as well for you, James, to see what it would take to convince you that God probably does exist. But before you answer as well, just to say I've got one more question after this, and then we'll wrap up if you're concerned about time or anything.
Look, it's hard for me to say that about God without any further clarifications, because it's easier to say about Christianity because then I can point to certain things it seems that we would maybe expect to see. But just God simpliciter, I mean, the only core properties that he would have to have is be omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, let's say, an immaterial mind with those properties. Something like that, that seems to be pretty core to God, at least an omni-God. I mean, I guess there's other conceptions. And what would it take to me to convince that it's most probable that it does exist? I mean, probably the best answer I could come up with is just much better philosophical / scientific arguments than have been outlined. I mean, probably a teleological type argument might be the strongest. The current fine-tuning argument, I debated Luke Barnes about this, and I don't think it's that good. I think it's quite weak at the moment, but I could imagine if the evidence changes, if we had a more developed argument, if we could rule out other possibilities, then that might be a stronger argument. So yeah, I guess basically I might say, cosmological or teleological arguments might be the strongest candidates, but they would need to be a lot stronger than they currently are, basically by ruling out other possibilities. That's a hand-wavy answer, I know, but that's the best I could come up with.
Awesome. So then I thought this could be a good closing question for both of you. So it would be, can they steel man each other's arguments? Obviously, you don't have 15 minutes to do it, but maybe in a brief 1 or 2 minute summary, could each of you sort of present what the other person, what you kind of think the other person has said in its kind of strongest form?
Yeah, I can go.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So, I hope I get this right, but always a possibility I'm off. So I think what James is trying to get at is there's all sorts of various possibilities with regards to what we're studying in science right now, and it's not enough data to make any sort of inference regarding the nature of the universe. Regardless of that, he's going to say that underlying material reality, there is some sort of, it'd be much more simpler to say some sort of non-material substance is sort of giving rise to everything without positing it being an agent of some sort. And he would say that as a far more simpler explanation than positing God. So I feel like that's kind of what he's getting at from both angles, is that science itself is still limited in a lot of ways, and material reality is a far simpler ontology. Yeah,
basically. And there's the question about explanatory scope as well, which is related to the simpler ontology. But yeah, that's essentially correct. So let me see how I go. So Michael is arguing for a theistic idealism, and he argues for that on the base, or partly on the basis of certain findings from emerging findings from physics relating to the emergence of space and time. Although what he's saying is not that the precise ontological reading that physicists give of those is correct, but rather they're consistent with what he says about the nature of reality, that it's emergent from something more fundamental. And what he thinks that more fundamental thing is God's mind. And he thinks that is a more parsimonious explanation in grounding everything in a necessary mind that from which everything else derives.
Thoughts
yeah,
on that?
I'm okay with that. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap it up on that note then. But before we do go, what are you guys both working on? What are the plans at the minute? Is there anything that you want to promote and put out there for people to come and look at? Do you want to go first on that, Michael? Someone said you're writing a book.
Oh, I am? That's news to me.
Someone said it in the chat, but yeah.
No, I'm not going to start writing a book till I get my graduate degree. I'm not even going to put pen to paper before I get to there.
Well, what are you studying at the moment, Michael?
Philosophy. So I'm at the University of Arizona. I'm getting my master's in philosophy right now. Cool. So that's what I'm studying right now.
Are you writing a thesis?
I've never decided if I'm going to, because I might continue on to get a PhD. I'm just not sure right now, and I might just wait for that. I don't need to do a thesis at the University of Arizona. Right. So, and plus the professor I wanted to study under retired because of COVID. So that kind of threw my plan. Yeah. So that was unfortunate. But in terms of upcoming videos, I do have a video on a lot of research I've been doing related to this. I'll be talking about some of the upcoming ideas, and as well as understanding what matter is from an idealist perspective. And then I have a 3-part series on the Old Testament law. I think part 2 might upset some Christians, but I don't care. And then I got some other videos coming out later, like I'm going to be doing a video on is Genesis borrowing from pagan myths like Gilgamesh, Adapa, or the another epic as well. So I'll be doing some stuff on that, and then I'm going to be going into some cultural context regarding honor and shame culture, patrons and clients. So that's what I got planned coming out for the upcoming some videos. And of course, I got a video on Jasher, the book of Jasher and why it's a forgery coming out in August.
Awesome. I think some people are also interested in if you're going to be doing like an after show on JFD apologetics or anything like that. I don't know if you.
Yeah, Kyle Allender and I already talked about doing that, I think in 2 days or so. So yeah, we're going to do that soon.
Awesome. And then over to you, I guess, James. What are you working on at the minute? And
so I will, in a couple of months, be starting a PhD in decision neuroscience. So I'm going to be studying human cognition and trying to understand how we think about things. So that'll be interesting. In addition to that, maybe I'll actually just quickly spruik my book, which I did before, but it can't hurt to do it again. So is that? Hang on, that's not right.
That's the slides there. Yeah,
that's the one. So there's my book, Unreasonable Faith. Oh, wow. He's got a physical copy. Nice. So in that book, I don't really talk about that much that's directly relevant to this debate. I mean, there's, I guess, a few issues there, but it's mostly a critique of William Lane Craig. You can also check out my science podcast where I just talk about different scientific topics, and so there's some quantum stuff in there if you're interested in that. In addition, there's my YouTube channel. So I'm doing mostly counter-apologetic stuff there at the moment, and maybe some related philosophical discussions. Also, if people are interested, I'm going to host just a follow-up chat conversation to this, just starting in a few minutes. So head over there, and everyone's welcome to join if you want to keep chatting or ask further questions. I think that's about it. Oh, I also wanted to thank Michael for coming on today. I think it was a good discussion. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did, and I hope also the audience found this useful to help them think through these issues.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was. There were a few minutes where I was thinking maybe I'm going to have to come in here and it's going to get a bit heated. But I think you both did like a really good job of presenting your kind of cases and communicating well, and it was really interesting to listen to. So thanks both for coming on, and also for conducting yourselves in the way you have and sticking to the kind of content and not people's characters and things like that. Really great to see.
Cheers! Cool. Thanks, Nathan, for hosting as well.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up there then. Thank you, everyone. Be sure to go and subscribe to Inspiring Philosophy. 200k subscribers. Your channel's quite a bit bigger than mine. And subscribe to James Fodor as well. And like and subscribe this video. Share it around if you thought it was interesting. Thank you, everyone, for watching.